2, 1.
Good afternoon. It is Monday, March 11th. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Committee. We have 2 items on our agenda today. First is a review of the transportation portion of the CIP, and this is the 3rd work session on the CIP, and today we'll be taking up specifically pedestrian facilities, bikeways, and some roads. The county executive is recommending $274 million over the next 6 years for these projects, and so we're going to take a deep dive this afternoon because we know that these projects are critically important to building out our pedestrian master plan and achieving our Vision Zero goals as well. And then after we get through the CIP, we will talk about the comprehensive water supply and sewer systems plan. So with that, Director Conklin, do you have any opening comments? No. I'll turn it over to Mr. Kenny to walk us through.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So this is the 3rd work session of this committee, scheduled to review the transportation portion of the FY 25 to 30 capital improvements program as recommended by the county executive. This work session will cover project by project review of the pedestrian facilities and bikeways and roads subcategories. A 4th and final CIP work session for this committee is scheduled for March 18th, next Monday, to follow up on outstanding questions from the first 3 work sessions. One thing I'll note before getting into the project by project, next week, you'll hear referenced in this work session a review of the CIP is written by the planning board. We'll touch on some of those items here, but we'll get a fuller briefing from the planning board during next week's work session. So we'll cover their review in full. Moving to the pedestrian facilities and bikeways subcategory, overall we see almost a $60 million decrease in funding over the 6-year period as recommended by the county executive. This is largely due to projects being moved out of the 6-year period that were previously approved to be within the 6-year period, and we'll get down to each of those projects as they come up. First, does the committee want or have any questions or want to get into any of the consent projects?
I'm good. I think we're all good, so we'll approve without objection.
Great. Moving to the bicycle pedestrian priority area, also referred to as BIPA improvements. This project provides for the design and construction of pedestrian and bicyclist capital improvements across the county's BIPAs as identified in county master plans. After this, we'll consider the specific projects for the Purple Line and Wheaton BIPAs, but this one covers the rest of these areas in the county. You'll see the map listed on page 3 indicates where these areas are located throughout the county. The ones shaded red and purple are funded within this CIP. The ones that are shaded green are not yet funded, but are adopted as BIPAs. And a list of currently funded BIPA projects can be found on circle page 229 and 230 of this packet. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive's expenditure schedule.
Yep, it's unanimous.
Great. Moving on to the, as I mentioned before, the specific project covering the Purple Line BIPA. This project, again, provides for the design and construction of high-priority bicycle and pedestrian capital improvements in areas adjacent to future Purple Line stations from Bethesda to Tacoma Park within a half-mile radius of each section, of each station. The county executive recommends adding $3 million to the total cost of this project to maximize the improvements the county can make in the area around future Purple Line stations before the Purple Line is complete. We had previously expected this project to be completed earlier and is now the Purple Line project, the MTA's Purple Line project. It'll now be completed in FY28, and hence the county executive's recommendation to add more projects to be completed before the MTA's project is complete.
Thank you for that. Did you comment?
You can go for it, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Deference to the district council member, and I see former district council member Tom Hucker is here as well. Good to see you, Tom. So, Director Conklin, this is the first project that we're talking about today that is tied to the Purple Line. There are many more projects we'll talk about. Can you talk to us about the county executive's view on how these projects relate to a project that continues to be delayed and we're not quite sure when it will be operational?
Sure. I think council staff gave a good impression here that these are walkability improvements to the stations, principally at the eastern end of the Purple Line in Montgomery County. And the proposal here is to accelerate work on these improvements so that we can have that infrastructure ready when the Purple Line opens. And granted, there's still uncertainty what that date is. It's been pushed back formally, and still 40% or so of the construction left to go on that project. So that was the rationale for increasing the funding here.
Great. Thank you for that. I absolutely agree about the need to make these communities and neighborhoods safer now as quickly as possible. I met with Secretary Wiedefeld a number of months ago and told him that, and particularly in these communities that we're specifically referencing, walking is difficult, biking is difficult, going to school, but then also, quite frankly, for people who are driving around there. We know that these are some of the more modest income communities in the entire region, and the disproportionate effects of the Purple Line are affecting them. So thank you for that. Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you. No, I'll just add to this, my thanks to, and the emphasis should be bolded, I feel like, in the staff packet before, and that this is moving forward and the $3 million has been added here, because we know these are communities that have been hard hit by the Purple Line construction, but they're also communities that needed this infrastructure even before we started the Purple Line construction. So I appreciate the attention to this and look forward to it moving forward.
Excellent, great. So that's
Great.
unanimous.
Thank you. This is the final BIPA project that we'll consider here. This is for the Wheaton Central Business District. This project funds the design and construction of bicycle and pedestrian capital infrastructure in the Wheaton Central Business District, BIPA, and identified in the Wheaton Central Business District and Vicinity Sector Plan. The executive recommends a $1.5 million increase to the total funding of this project, mostly to accommodate increased costs for design and construction of the Amherst Avenue Bikeway, a two-way separated bikeway on the west side of Amherst Avenue from Arcola Avenue to Wyndham Lane. A full list of the BIPA projects in the Wheaton CBD can be found on Circle page 231. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
Without objection.
Thank you. Moving on to the Bikeway Program minor projects. This program provides for the planning, design, and construction of bikeways, trails, neighborhood greenways, and directional route signs as specified by master plans and or requested by communities. The project constructs bicycle facilities that typically cost under $1 million. Due to inflation and the addition of FY 29 and 30 to this level of effort project, the county executive recommends a $4.6 million increase in total project expenditures. In addition, this committee was briefed by MCDOT during its January 24th work session of this year on the Phase 1 planning, facility planning study of one of the sub-projects of this bikeway program, the Washington Grove Connector Project. During that work session, the committee moved to support the Planning Board's recommendation to prioritize the Brown Street Connector portion of the project, but the committee did not take action at that time and instead chose to take action in its CIP review. Therefore, council staff recommends amending this project to reflect the committee's preference for the Brown Street trail improvements in the Washington Grove Connector sub-project of this project. So this would just be an amendment to the project description, clarifying the committee's preferences, and otherwise concurring with the county executive's proposed expenditure schedule.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. That was a correct summary of that January meeting where we were explicitly asked to hold and to include that project or phase of it in the CIP, and we were all supportive of it then.
I just have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to confirm that there's no additional funding, it's just moving the priority.
That's correct. The project was already included financially. It just was omitted from the project description and map, and that has been corrected in your packet. Circle 234 is the corrected map.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. So that is unanimous support.
Thank you. Moving on to the Bowie Mill Road Bikeway. This project provides for the design and construction of a new 8 to 10 foot wide side path for the 3.3 miles along Bowie Mill Road from only Laytonsville Road to Muncaster Mill Road and continues along Muncaster Mill Road to Needwood Road. The executive recommends a $10 million increase in total project expenditures during this 6-year period due to updated cost estimates from the now completed final design project phase. The $2 million of state aid that's reflected for this project is currently being pursued through the 2024 Maryland General Assembly session. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
Thank you. So, Director Conklin, this has been a short and windy road for the Bowie Mill roadway and bikeway, working very closely with our District 14 delegation, who has provided some funding along the way. So can you talk about the $10 million increase there?
Sure. As we finalize the design efforts for this, and there's still a little bit of work to do, but we're much further along, we had a better understanding of what the earthwork and utility relocation elements were of this, and it is a complicated corridor with a lot of slope along the road and utilities adjacent. So that's what has driven the cost increase here. And just a note on the state funding assumed in here, there's about $10 million of state funding assumed, 3.5 or so are in hand, and the rest of that is being sought over the next couple legislative cycles. And this year, we're hoping to get another 2.1 million of this, and then the remainder of it in the next couple years to fill out this funding cycle. Otherwise, we will still have a gap in this project. But that's where we are with the design and funding effort.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the state funding in total. I know it was more than $2 million, and again, our appreciation to Senator Zucker in particular and former Delegate Ludke for helping carry that. So I'm good with this, as long as we keep it on track. So that's unanimous.
Thank you. Moving on to the Bradley Boulevard Improvements Project. This project provides for completing final design and construction for the master planned dual bikeway along Bradley Boulevard, Maryland 191, which includes 2 11-foot traffic lanes, 2 4-foot on-road bike lanes, and a 10-foot off-road shared use path on the north side of the road, as well as a 5-foot sidewalk on the south side of the road. The executive recommends delaying the entirety of this project beyond the 6-year period we're considering here, so beyond FY30, to create GEO-bond fiscal capacity elsewhere in the CIP. For context, I've included a number of items of correspondence and testimony that the council has received, both in favor and in opposition to the project, or rather in favor of the county executive's delay and in opposition to the county executive's delay, so bringing it back into the CIP for the record. If the committee were to recommend restoring this project to its previously approved schedule, so within the 6-year period, MCDOT could complete final design and land acquisition in FY25 for this project and complete construction by FY28. This alternative is in the expenditure schedule required to meet this alternative is reflected in the FY25 to 30 restored schedule row in the expenditure table below. So I've included this FY25 to 30 restored schedule scenario for each of the projects where the county executive proposed moving out of the 6-year CIP. So this will be a theme today.
If I could just provide some fiscal context for this and some of the other delays and reductions for fiscal capacity that we're going to be talking about. Apologize if you've heard this before, but typically when we add new projects to the CIP, in approved CIP, those are added in the last 2 years. because those are the years that have the most fiscal capacity. When it comes time to develop the next CIP, we typically deal with a lot of cost increases. We have some structural issues, including what is always a large request from schools that is front-loaded. For example, to give you an example of the magnitude we're talking about, this year the request from schools for the first 4 years in the CIP was $515 million, and the executive was only able to fund $169 million of that in the first 4 years of the CIP. Additionally, we have required maintenance projects and cost increases for existing projects. So these projects that were added in the out years that have not yet started construction are typically the ones that do get deferred. And also just want to mention the Education Culture Committee is working hard to try to reconcile the school's request with what is affordable. They may need to make some tough decisions. Additionally, we have volatile revenue sources. Due to the state of the housing market, we could see some write-downs to the recordation taxes that are a large source of funding for the CIP that could present some more challenges. Thank you.
I appreciate you framing the conversation that way, because this is the first item that we'll be discussing where the county executive has delayed something outside. And there are a number of other projects here that are under that same, those same parameters. But Director Conklin, I see in the notes that 70% of the design is already has already happened. If this were to be delayed even further, does that 70% stay intact? Is that usable?
It does stay intact. There are always risks with change in the characteristics of property along the corridor during that time, or also any regulatory change for things like stormwater management that may require the design to be revisited. But aside from those sorts of issues, the design that has been progressed remains valid. When we pick it up again, we'll have to look and see if there are any changes along those lines. But yes, the design is useful at this stage for a period of time. Eventually it will become not useful, but we don't know when that is. It depends on how much the world changes during that period.
Very prophetic. Okay. Colleagues, Councilmember Balcombe.
Thank you. And as Chair Glass stated, this is the first one that we'll get to today. So can you just talk a little bit about the decision process for which projects are presented to be delayed, and what characteristics, are they just specific to each project, or was there a general paradigm that you used for which projects to cut?
I think Mr. Nalvin touched on it briefly in his remarks, but one of the first screening activities we look at to see which projects might be candidates for delay are the ones that there hasn't been a step towards right-of-way acquisition or construction. So once we're to those stages, we try to keep those projects whole, and sometimes there are cost increases in those projects that we need to deal with. So projects that are in the planning or design phase are the ones that are usually considered as candidates for delay. The earlier in that, the more likely. The overall cost of the project is an element of that consideration. So, for example, North High Street project is in this CIP as well. That project is relatively small in cost and can be implemented with a low degree of risk. So a project like that is less of a candidate for delay than a larger project that has more utility construction right-of-way risk, where the costs may change substantially when we move into construction. And then there's also some consideration of how long the project has been in the CIP as an indication over a longer period of time how much support is there for moving that project forward. This project has been in the CIP for not the longest. There's some in here that are much, much longer, but a relatively long time. And the record of public support for implementing this project is more mixed than some other projects that are in here. And then there's a factor, obviously, of the technical merits, and the county executive's view of the merits of the project have some way in his rating and figuring out which ones to delay and which ones not to delay.
Okay, thank you.
Stewart?
Yeah. Thank you, Director Conklin, for that. I know this project has had a long history, and as you mentioned, particularly with some of the public support for that, I actually, the Citizens Advisory Committee board that represents this area, I actually get to share with Council President Friedson, and was recently there and talking to members of the public about the CIP. And and again, we received a letter from Council President Friedson requesting that this be put in, back in. And so I'd like to look at this project as one that we consider putting back in and bringing back to our colleagues on the full council. Again, I don't represent this area, so I don't want to speak on behalf of the council president who does, but it was my sense from being at the CAB meeting that the support for this project in the community has increased.
Thank you, Vice President Stewart and Councilmember Balcombe. So what I'd like to recommend is that as we move forward from this point on, and any decisions that we make regarding projects that the county executive has delayed beyond the CIP that's before us, we put on a secondary list. That we can work through once we determine what the MCPS CIP is and what remains before us. There are a lot of large ticket items, much larger than this, that will not fit squarely into the budget. So we'll have to take that into totality. But on its merits, this project does have merits and I think is worthy of future consideration. So without objection, if we can create a separate list, and we'll add this to that list.
To discuss during next week's work session or just throughout the budget?
Yes to both, probably to the latter, to the reconciliation, once we see what the school CIP is as well, and what we do this afternoon.
If I could just clarify that,
Please.
does that mean that the projects that are put on that secondary list, is that the committee recommending reversing the delay of those projects?
So at this point in time, that would be the interpretation, but it is clearly pursuant to figuring out the budget, right? And so it signals that the committee supports the project and wants to figure out how we can make it happen. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, but we're going to have a future conversation on it. Agreed?
Yeah, I
Great.
think the language on the cover page for Mr. Kenny is, decisions here should be considered preliminary at this time, pending full review of all CIP priorities during the budget reconciliation project.
There you go.
Okay.
So noting the committee's general support for this project, but looking to revisit during.
Correct. That's right.
All right. Moving on to the Capitol Crescent Trail project. This project provides for the funding of the Capitol Crescent Trail, a number of improvements that are included in the packet along the trail. The executive recommends a net $66.3 million decrease in total project costs, primarily resulting from spinning off the Capitol Crescent Trail Tunnel project into its own project. That is new in this CIP, that the tunnel being separate from the main Capitol Crescent Trail project in this CIP. So council staff recommends concurring with the executive, mostly because this the remaining improvements in this project have not been altered.
Great. Director
Speak
Conklin.
to one thing in this project. This project does complete the trail connection between the end of the work of the Purple Line at Pearl Street and the work that's already been completed in downtown Bethesda. So the trail connection through the Elm Street Park and along, I always get it wrong, is it 46th Street? 7th Street, the other side of the park, to make the connection at the Farm Women's Market site and then across to the existing Capitol Crescent Trail at Woodmont Avenue.
Great. Without objection?
Yep.
Great.
All right. Moving on to this new project spun off from the previous one, the Capitol Crescent Trail Tunnel. This project will provide for a grade-separated crossing of State Route 355, and will serve pedestrians, bicyclists, joggers, and skaters, and will be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Bethesda CBD Sector Plan, and the Purple Line Functional Master Plan. The executive, this is another that the executive is recommending be delayed beyond the 6-year period in this CIP, largely due to fiscal capacity. This is another one for which I've provided a restored schedule if the council or if this committee were to recommend restoring the project into this 6-year period. Although it should be noted that in previous years there was an assumption that this tunnel project could be funded by a federal RAISE grant, but the application for that grant was unsuccessful. So the council would need to supplement the rest of that funding with GO bonds or other revenue, or other funding sources rather. Yes, that's all I have.
Great. Thank you. So when we were talking about the pedestrian access along the Purple Line in the East Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, Long Branch area, I alluded to other big projects that are contingent on the Purple Line, and this is the biggest project that is in the CIP, or put another way, is not in the CIP right now, that is contingent on the Purple Line. So I think it has to be said, and I think there would be unanimous agreement among everyone in the community that we're all still frustrated with the Purple Line and the continued delays. And the delay that we heard just last week, there was an asterisk, and it is possible that there will be more delays beyond that. Eyes wide open. And so how do we reconcile those continuing delays and escalating costs with other needs that are obvious and needs that I think need to be met? Director Conklin, what is the administration's view on the delays on the Purple Line? Noting, and I have to note, that in every CIP, the county executive has defunded this project. And the only reason that it is in the CIP at all is because the previous council continued to support it. And so it's no surprise that it's X'd out, but the escalating costs are noteworthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can give some context to this project. It is no secret that the executive does not believe that this project is a good allocation of resources within a constrained CIP. It's a very complex project to construct. It's all underground construction. It would be sort of redisrupting the area that's been disrupted by the Purple Line excavation for the connection to the south entrance of the WMATA station. It's a very long tunnel going from the portal at the Apex building underneath Maryland 355, underneath a full block of street beyond that, and daylighting in Elm Street Park. The construction of that portal will redisrupt that corner of the park. It's very unlikely to be on the same timeline at this point as the connection of the trail to the park. So we would be either revisiting the design or redisrupting the trail connection that had been constructed. And other elements of this, we did apply for the RAISE grant 2 times. We applied a first round. It was not well rated. We brought in a peer review team from the University of Maryland Build America Bureau to review that application. We submitted it again. It fared better, but still was not awarded. This cycle, we did not do that. We submitted a RAISE grant for the North Bethesda Metro second entrance that just went in a couple weeks ago. So we don't have a current grant that we're pursuing for this. As I mentioned earlier, the surface connection will be completed at or before the completion of the Purple Line. And at a minimum, it seems prudent that we would see how well that connection is working before embarking on spending, $80-ish million on this tunnel. And a project, and I mentioned construction risk earlier, this project probably has more construction risk than any project we would undertake other than the very large BRT projects that are many, many miles in width, given the nature of the utility infrastructure, the below-grade construction at and adjacent to existing structures like the Elm and Wilson buildings, existing older buildings along the alignment. So that's kind of the history of this. The benefit of it is that it creates that seamless connection across Wisconsin Avenue, in a below-grade fashion, but we are still needing to cross Woodmont Avenue when you get to the other portal of that tunnel. So there is some benefit in creating this more seamless trail, but at a very high cost, very high risk. And obviously, $80 million is a lot of resource to devote to a single project like this. So that's a little bit about the executive's view of it. He has tried to find other alternatives, like including the trail in the Purple Line Tunnel. That obviously wasn't viable based on the state's review, and believes that the surface connection needs to have a try and see how that works and see if that's an attractive and efficient way for people to make the entire trip on the Capitol Crescent Trail from the district through Bethesda and on to Silver Spring when the portion being constructed by the Purple Line is complete.
Thank you. I'm not looking at it right now, but do we have or can someone articulate what the cost escalation of this project has been over the last number of cycles?
It started out at an estimate that wasn't based in any particular design. And when we got a first design, I don't have the history of it, but I think it was a several-fold increase with the first basis of design. And given the degree of escalation, some expansion of that design, and there's still some unaccounted for things in here like life safety systems and some ventilation type items. That's the first element of design you see in this revised schedule. I believe the estimate has changed by at least a factor of 4 in the time it's been before the council. But I'm not positive of that. We can give you the specific starting estimate and where we are now after this meeting, if you'd like.
Yeah, and just anecdotally, or depending on how I remember it, I believe that in the first CIP I took up, it was around $40 million, I think. So, colleagues?
I just know that it's terribly frustrating for everyone involved, and to Council President Friedson's view of, the promise that was made when the trail was when the reconstruction was begun, right? That this was going to happen, that it was going to be a safe crossing. But I understand that. Can you, Mr. Conklin, just define construction risk for me?
Sure. There are some projects that have a relatively well understood set of conditions before you begin construction. So we talked about the Brown Street trail connection through the park. We know there's a stream there. We know there are trees there. We know there are not utilities in the way of that. We know that the property is under control of the Parks Department. We don't anticipate, there's still some risk, we don't anticipate finding hazardous materials. So that the risk profile of that project is relatively constrained. The risk
Basically, you don't know what you're going to find until
this project, right, is excavation beneath Maryland 355, another city of street that have utilities that have been built over decades and decades, some mapped, some not mapped, tying into previous construction, and whether that construction occurred as it was intended and everything lines up, daylighting in a park. But the biggest risk to most of these projects are utilities, the presence of utilities or hazardous materials. And in these sorts of urban environments with entirely below grade construction, those risks are higher than they are in many other projects we would take on.
Thank you.
Vice President Stewart?
Yeah, so I know here we're showing the breakout of the finishing the surface trail and breaking out the tunnel in the CIP for the first time, breaking these two out, correct?
That is correct. It's the first time they've been broken out because we wanted to be sure we could complete the surface trail connection independent of the path of the tunnel.
And what communication has happened with the community in terms of the proposal of let's do the surface trail first, see how that goes, and then revisit?
We haven't had a specific set of outreach with the community, but that's been part of the dialogue around this project since the planning phase of the project.
Okay.
So 7, 8 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
To the point that's been raised about commitments to the community, which I absolutely agree with, I think it's also important that we take a further step back and recognize that in master plans and sector plans that have been approved over the decades, there have been hundreds of projects proposed that never came to fruition. And you know a lot of them up in your district, Councilmember Balcombe. And that is not an excuse for not making progress or fulfilling promises, but it is an eyes wide open that sometimes things happen, developments change. What I would like to recommend is that we add this to that list that we are starting to fill of projects that we support, and we will work through the budget to see how we can make them happen. Is that unanimous? Yep, great, thank you.
Not to dissuade you from that action, it doesn't at all, but the initial time this was in the CIP, it appears it was 53 million.
Pardon me?
It appears it was 53 million when it first entered the CIP for construction. It was in there for a small amount for planning and design before that, and I believe there were other lower estimates during the master planning process that predate it being in the CIP.
And that was a pre-COVID construction estimate.
Right, so it's gone from, in the last 4 years, 5 years, it's gone from 53 to 81. Right, okay. Okay. Mr. Kenny?
Moving on to the Dale Drive shared use path and safety improvements. This project provides for the design and construction of a new 8-foot wide shared use path, approximately 1 mile of length along the north side of Dale Drive from Georgia Avenue to Colesville Road. The executive recommends adding $1.7 million to this project for inflation and utility relocation. Funding for those utility relocations is split with WSSC, reflected in the intergovernmental funding category of this project form. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
Yes.
Yes, yes. Explanation points.
Yes. All right, moving on to the Falls Road Bikeway and Pedestrian Facility. This project provides funds to develop final design plans, acquire right-of-way, and construct approximately 4 miles of an 8 to 10 foot bituminous hiker and biker path along the east side of Falls Road from River Road to Dunster Road. A portion of this project is funded by the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program grant in the amount of $1.23 million. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
Great. Thank you. Director.
I would just note that this is a project that entered the CIP in FY09 and hasn't substantially advanced over many, many cycles. And there is a shortfall in the recordation taxes that we are revisiting the schedule of this project. You may see an amendment for this project.
Appreciate the context. You said 09. There you go. Thank you.
All right. Moving on to the Fenton Street cycle track. This project provides for the design and construction of the Fenton Street cycle track in the Silver Spring CBD BIPA. The specific improvements are noted in the staff report. The executive recommends a $4.6 million increase to this project due to higher than expected utility relocation costs, updated construction estimates, and to incorporate the addition of best practice design elements for bikeway safety and stormwater management. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
We concur.
Great. The Forest Glen Passageway. This project provides for the design, right-of-way acquisition, utility relocation, and construction of a new grade-separated connection under Georgia Avenue to improve access to the Forest Glen Metro Station from neighborhoods and institutions located on the east side of Georgia Avenue. This is another project which the executive recommends delaying by 2 years, so not out of the 6-year period, but just by 2 years, starting construction in FY28 rather than the previously scheduled FY26 in order to create GO bond fiscal capacity in those earlier years of the CIP. Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez wrote a letter that is included in this packet on circle pages 240 and 241, requesting that the committee restore the Forest Glen Passageway to its previously approved schedule. Again, if the council were to do this, or if the committee were to make this recommendation and the council were to do this, the restored schedule, expenditure schedule is reflected in the table in the staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Kenny. And yes, we received the communication from District Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez about this. This is yet another project that continues slipping through every CIP. And, you know, noteworthy as well that just today, the planning board approved the development of that medical office building right there at the corner. That would be the entrance to this tunnel, and that's going to be converted into multifamily housing. And the community is concerned, certain members of the community are concerned about the need for all the parking in that new building that is catty corner to the metro station. And I have reached out to the developer saying we just passed a ZTA. You are across the street from the metro. You do not need that many parking spaces. And for better or for worse, the planning board approved the design today. But a tunnel would provide further evidence that all those parking spaces are not needed. And it would facilitate better safety measures getting across an incredibly busy Georgia Avenue State Highway. Director Conklin, adding to the mix of that intersection, do you have any updates or do you know of that WMATA property and the potential redevelopment of that surface parking lot?
I haven't heard any updates recently. I know they've had a series of different planning studies for that, and one of the limitations was the financial viability for WMATA of incorporating replacement parking for the commuters in that development. So I'm not sure how that dynamic has changed over the last 18 months or 2 years, but that was the last
We just
time I
passed
heard
the ZTA, so that might add to the financial, the math of making that work. But recognizing that WMATA is working really hard to build more multifamily there as well, I think is all the more reason why we need to move forward and help support this particular intersection. I would be supportive of restoring the Forest Glen passageway, and I'm going to recommend putting it on the list and for consideration, whether it is front-loading it back to its original schedule or at least finding a middle ground to make the math work, recognizing how hard this is. But that area continues to grow. Evidence of it from news coming from the planning board today, and again with WMATA down the road. So that's going to be my recommendation. Yeah, Councilmember Stewart.
I agree with that recommendation. And since this is a 2-year delay versus pushing it all the way out, I guess some questions I have that is timing of, right, this development that was just okayed by the planning board. We also have the Montgomery Hills project. In this area, there's a lot of moving pieces, and I guess I'd like to understand the advantages and disadvantages of when to move forward with this project from your perspective.
It would be wonderful if we could all sync up our
Yeah.
construction timelines, but that usually doesn't happen. The developer's going to have his own timeline based on financing for that project. Given where we are today, it's likely that that building will be in construction first and may impact when we can start based on having adjacent construction in a relatively small space. I don't think it's likely we would build this project before the private project, given where they are in their approval timeline. If that had been the case, it would be wonderful to have their site available for laydown and construction staging for this project, but that seems relatively unlikely. And I think the state highway improvements I don't think quite get up to this point. So
No,
there's
but
not a lot
sort
of direct overlap.
Commuting and like just the general area, yeah.
Yeah, when we get to that point, we'll have to understand the impact of any of our below-grade work here on the configuration of Georgia Avenue and if that has any bearing on the state's work further south. So it's like they will have an impact on each other for sure, but we don't know what that impact is until there's a firm construction schedule from one or the other.
Great. Well, maybe when we move this forward to the full council, since that project did just get planning board approval, more conversations with the developer there on their plans moving forward might help us.
We are in contact with them because the property acquisition that's mentioned in here is from that owner.
Great, so maybe we'll have more information before it comes to full council.
I think that's an excellent question, and it might complicate things, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
right, no, right.
It's a CIP.
Yeah, right. I mean, the construction of the residential building,
Yeah. Oh,
right,
right.
right. And so it might be forced to be delayed by
Exactly,
due
so
of, right,
Right.
understood.
No, that's good.
Good.
Yep.
So we'll make that recommendation for further consideration.
Moving on to the Goldsboro Road Sidewalk and Bikeway project. This project provides for the final design and construction of two 11-foot travel lanes for a 1-mile segment of Goldsboro Road, State Route 614, from MacArthur Boulevard to River Road. A shared use path along the north side, a 5-foot sidewalk on the south side at select locations. The executive recommends delaying all project components beyond the 6-year period to create fiscal capacity elsewhere in the CIP. This is another project where the county executive recommends delaying past 6 years, and council staff has provided what the restored schedule would look like. This restored schedule actually moves the project up a year past where it was previously approved, just so the committee can see what the 6-year expenditure schedule would look like. But that is, so looking at the expenditure schedule, the $364,000 first year can start in FY25, FY26, or any year. So it's flexible as with every project.
What is the length of this bikeway?
It's approximately 1 mile from Goldsboro, MacArthur Boulevard to River Road.
So MacArthur, right, so MacArthur to River, it's about 1 mile, and what's the cost?
$20 million.
Total cost for this project is just over $21 million.
Okay. So a $21 million mile project. Okay.
For further context, this is a complicated corridor. It's
Yep.
adjacent to a very active stream in a constrained sloping environment, and that's the reason why the cost.
Definitely sloping, right, absolutely. Beautiful part of the county as well. And absolutely understand the need for the infrastructure, especially as people head down to MacArthur and head down to the further bike trails and hiking trails that are down there. Director Conklin, any other thoughts as to the delay?
The only other comment is that the state is doing some erosion control and other work in this corridor now, which may change the project costs. We don't know whether for the better or the worse. It's possible to the better as they complete that work. But I already mentioned the complexity of constructing this facility, and that's one of the reasons it's here as a candidate for delay.
Colleagues, any thoughts?
No, I guess, Mr. Kenny, the comment about waiting, until next week, what more information would we have other than what a restored schedule would look like?
So we have received all the information that we need in the updated packet as.
Oh, got it. Okay, sorry. The wrong one.
Right, so the question is whether or not we want to just add that to the list as well for consideration. I will say that a $21 million per mile project does give me pause as we look at the CIP in totality. Not every project is broken down that way, but this is a simple project to look at in those terms. And just as we're talking about wanting to restore the Capitol Crescent Trail and whether or not we can do anything with the Forest Glen Passageway, these are all very tough decisions. But again, recognizing this is a very active road, an active part of our community. The need is real, and so are the budgetary constraints. So I'm getting the sense that we'll add it to the list and see. Yeah, Councilmember Stewart.
Mr. Kenny, not to make your life more difficult, but I may in a moment. I do think, I'm not going to ask us to prioritize these, but I do think capturing, because I agree with the chair on the kind of the cost benefit analysis here, which is different than on some of the other projects we've put on this list, right? Like Forest Glen, we want to hear more about the conversations and other things. Here, we want to add to the list, but I think I'll speak for my colleagues and they'll tell me if I'm wrong, that given the cost of this, there's a bit more pause here about moving this one forward. So if we could just capture all of that, because there's a lot of projects we're going through, to make sure that the decisions we're making here, we can clearly transfer over to our colleagues. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Well said.
All right. Moving on to the Good Hope Road shared use path. This project provides for the design and construction of a new 8-foot wide side path along the west side of Good Hope Road, over 4,500 feet of length from Windmill Lane to Rainbow Drive in Cloverly. The council approved a supplemental appropriation for a $562,000 increase to this project during its work session on September 26, 2023, my first day here, so I don't think I was present for that one, but I imagine the committee remembers that conversation. All the same, the council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
And we agree.
Great. Moving on to the Life Sciences Center Loop Trail. This project provides for the planning and construction of a 3.5-mile Life Sciences Center Loop Trail, a 12-foot wide shared use path that is a central feature of the Life Sciences Center area of the Great Seneca Science Corridor Master Plan. The land acquisition and construction phases of this project will be funded by developer contributions, but the developers for the project area have not yet been identified. That is why the executive recommends delaying land acquisition until FY27 and construction until FY29. So while elsewhere in the CIP delays are, caused by concerns about fiscal capacity, this one is caused by sort of natural delays on the ground in terms of securing funding sources.
Thank you. Director Conklin, what kind of land is needed? What kind of land would be acquired for this? Is it right-of-way? Is it?
It is right-of-way, so it's generally, 5 to 10-foot strips along existing developed property. When this project was put into the CIP, it was put in with the implementation funding being contributions. One of the things we've noticed as we've advanced this project is that the contributions line item doesn't necessarily line up with where the work is. So I think in a subsequent CIP, we need to revisit the allocation of funding here or make other decisions about this project. But right now, we've finished a facility planning study for the portion that you see in here on green. There aren't very many active developments that line up with that portion. Some things were recently built, some things are not yet in the pipeline. So the implementation using contributions as the mechanism has become a little bit problematic in terms of advancing the project beyond design. That's not true of all of it. The red portion labeled Bellward Campus Drive, a big portion of that is being constructed as part of the former Public Safety Training Academy redevelopment that's underway now. And then there are other elements here that are adjacent to MCPS property with the Crown High School that it's a little bit unclear about whether the public sector construction will fund some of the completion of these elements or not. So there's a lot of uncertainty in that developer contribution component of that project, but otherwise the concept is a strong concept that you see in the diagram.
Absolutely. On the Economic Development Committee, we've had a number of conversations about the life sciences community and them wanting a real community, right? And so this type of amenity is clearly something not only the businesses would want, but more importantly, what their employees would want to go into work and to be part of it. I want to drill down a little bit more on the developer contributions. You said are the expected developer contributions, it's unsure where they're going, whether it's going to the Crown High School, future Crown High School, or elsewhere?
When this project was funded in the CIP, which I think was 2 cycles ago, the council made the decision that since this was a staging requirement of the plan and that many of the parcels were fronting anticipated development lots, that we could anticipate that those projects would complete the trail. As this gets further into the development of the trail, that's a little less clear because some of the sites are publicly controlled and going to be a high school. Some of the sites are the National Cancer Institute already developed and established. Some of them are the Shady Grove Medical Campus, which has its entitlements and may not contribute further. Some of them are being implemented in exactly that model because they're in the heart of areas that are being reconstructed by private development. So it's just turned out to be a more complicated mix than had been known at the time this decision was first made.
Sure, and so put another way, what I'm hearing you say is that when this project was conceived and put into the CIP, things have changed a little bit since then.
That's
Still-
correct.
Still a well-intentioned, good project, but the environment is a little different.
Yes, the environment is more complex than was appreciated at the time that decision was made.
And I think that statement holds true for almost everything that is in here, which is why I'm emphasizing it, right? And that might be the clearest example of why something has fallen out of the CIP. Because at the time when it was conceived or designed, right, we thought things would be a little differently. Yeah, Councilmember Balcombe.
Thank you. So I co-chaired the Great Seneca Science Corridor Implementation Committee for many, many years. Need to get rid of those waivers. This whole area is going through a major, I hope, will go through a major redevelopment. And so I think that it makes sense to move this out. The sector plan, right now, the sector plan is really focusing in on this. And so I'm not sure if it will even change the actual loop. I think the loop is really important. I think the community really has relied on the loop from the perspective of having some outdoor amenity, walking, hiking, biking, whatever the loop is going to be. So I think it's very important, but I appreciate the delay.
Okay. So we will concur with the county executive's recommendation.
Great. Moving on to the MacArthur Boulevard bikeway improvements. This project provides a shared use path improvements along 4.7 miles of MacArthur Boulevard from I-495 to the District of Columbia border. Construction of the project segment from the Beltway to Oberlin Avenue was completed in FY15. The other segment from Oberlin Avenue to the DC line will complete final design in FY24 and will begin construction in FY25. You'll see a slightly different expenditure schedule, but the timeline for project completion has not changed from last year's approved CIP, and will still the portion from Oberlin Avenue to the DC line will still begin construction in FY25 and be completed in FY26. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
Another really important infrastructure project, recognizing how high demand there is for that recreational activity around there. So I concur with the county executive. Yep. And we all do.
Great. Moving on to the Maryland 355 Clarksburg shared use path. This project will provide design, land acquisition, utility relocations, and construction of a new 8 to 10 foot wide shared use bike path along the eastern side of Frederick Road from Snowden Farm Parkway to just north of Clarksburg Road and just south of the intersection to Stringtown Road. The executive recommends adding $2.45 million to this project to increase due to an increase in land cost and construction inflation. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
Turn it over to District Council Member.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm in full agreement. Just a note: the proposed library site might be right on that very corner. Thank you.
We'll find out.
We'll find out. Stay tuned.
Lots of community conversations about that. Very good. I'll agree?
Yep.
Great. Unanimous.
Great. Moving on to the Metropolitan Branch Trail. This project provides for the design, land acquisition, utility relocations, and construction of the 0.6 mile segment of Metropolitan Branch Trail in Montgomery County between the end of the existing trail in Tacoma Park and connecting that trail now to all the way to the Silver Spring Transit Center. Project costs have remained unchanged, but the executive recommends a 2-year delayed schedule for completing Phase 2A, as labeled in the map in the staff report, to begin in FY24 and be completed in about 18 months. I'll note an error in the staff report. The cause for this delay is what was added later, but the previous text was not removed. So the cause for this delay is just a different scope in the project. So you'll see the in the map on page 18 of the packet, there is a dashed section that would have been an underpass. The county executive decided that that was due to costs and decided to adjust the scope instead to create an alternate route around that project, or around that dotted section that was formerly in place, so that this alternate route could be funded under, in addition to this project, under the BIPA improvements and Fenton Street cycle track projects. And this is due to both the cost of the underpass that was previously planned and the enhanced safety of the alternate route. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
District Councilmember?
Oh, yeah. I have lots of questions on this one. Thank you. So one, I have to say, the Metropolitan Branch Trail is so important. I mean, this is creating not just a bike path, but a commuter path for our residents in the Silver Spring Tacoma Park area to get to DC, and it's been a lot of work over the years. I guess, Director Conklin, if you could just walk us through the what Mr. Kenny just talked about, the alternative path, what this delay will do, because this is already having an impact on Selim Road, on our businesses there, and what has been blocked off for Progress Place. And so if you could just walk us through what we're doing here.
It is relatively complex.
Yeah.
So the delays in this project is delayed far beyond these issues. There are a number of delays that were experienced getting historic area work permit next to the train station in Progress Place, and then further delays getting easements and right to work permission from CSX, which is adjacent to this. We then had some procurement challenges in having a non-responsive bid, and we had to re-advertise. We re-advertised. The project came in at roughly $7 million more than the budget. And as we were working through how to proceed from there, we didn't want to experience more delays. So we issued a limited notice to proceed to construct the component you see in the diagram as 2A. So we are trying to keep that as on time as possible. And what that completes is the element from the Silver Spring Transit Center across Georgia Avenue to the intersection of Selim Road. So the bridge over Georgia Avenue is a component of that, and the area in front of Progress Place is a component of that. The area around Progress Place will not be returned in the way that it was before. The trail will be located between the train station and the parking, and there will be less parking there when this is complete. So that is a permanent change to that location. And then to figure out what to do from there, there were a couple developments that occurred since this project first was planned. One is the Fenton Street cycle track was not a thing when this project was developed. So the project was recommending going parallel to Selim Road and then going down and underneath Burlington and then connecting to King Street. As we looked at this challenge, we noted, well, we now have a Fenton Street cycle track building a bikeway on Fenton Street south of Burlington. We also have a BIPA project to create a cycle facility on Burlington. And it appears that having this subterranean area under Burlington next to the CSX and WMATA tracks and below the eyesight of Selim Road and then hidden behind a building at another dead end might not be the best environment to create. So we could get the project done faster and within the approved budget by, instead of going down and under Burlington Avenue, coming up to grade at Selim and Burlington, staying on the north side of Burlington and connecting to the Fenton Street cycle track to make that last connection. So we're saving $6 or $7 million by doing that. Probably no actual schedule impact from making this change, because the longest most difficult part of the project was the tunneling activity under Burlington Road. And we think having the cycle track at the surface and visible from the streets is going to be a safer outcome, or not the cycle track, but the Metropolitan Branch Trail will be a safer outcome than having it sort of in a cut next to the train tracks and then behind buildings linking to King Street. So that's the change that's proposed. It's a budget neutral change. It's probably a schedule positive change. But it is different than what the initial scope of the project was.
If I was following along, so does this mean we're not going down Selham?
We are still constructing next to Selham, but we are going to be roughly at the same grade as Selham rather than diving
Whoa,
down.
Got it. Okay.
So the construction on Selham will proceed, if you approve this, it will proceed in concert with the rest of the work.
Right.
If you wanted us to build the original scope, then we have to find the money and.
Yeah. No, I think the scope makes sense to me, the
Okay.
changing of the scope. I agree with everything you've just said. I'm just also trying to figure out the delay here.
Delay has already occurred.
Right, that's okay, thank you. That was the part I was not understanding. Okay,
Delay of the past, not the delay of the future.
got it. Okay. Then I'm good with this then, I think, because then there's no delay that we're talking about moving forward with.
anticipate further delay.
And it's just shifting the scope of the project, staying within this budget, and actually getting us what sounds like a much better path than having to go below and
That's
yeah.
our opinion.
I concur. Thank you.
I agree with that and appreciate the situational awareness with regard to going below grade or going low when there are other aesthetic issues to deal with. So I think that makes sense. So
Yep.
good questions. Thank you. So we'll all support this.
Great. So moving on to the Seven Locks Bikeway and Safety Improvements Project. This project provides for pedestrian and bicycle improvements for dual bicycle facilities on and off-road, as well as enhanced continuous pedestrian facilities along Seven Locks Road from Montrose Road to Bradley Boulevard, plus a bike path on Montrose Road between Seven Locks Road and the I-270 ramp northbound and eastbound auxiliary through lanes, with on-road bike lanes at the intersection of Seven Locks and Tuckerman Lane. So you'll see this project is broken down into 3 phases, as you'll see highlighted in the packet as well as on the map. The project costs in this CIP as it stands now only reflect phase 1 of the project. Total project costs are estimated to reach approximately $70 million, though that and just the $26 million figure for just phase 1 have not been updated in recent years and are therefore a rough estimate. So this is a project that was both previously approved last year to be beyond 6 years and was recommended by the county executive this year to remain beyond 6 years due to the need to update cost estimates and get a better handle on the scope of on the costs of the project. So for this reason, due to the outstanding information needed and the council's decision in FY24 to keep all project funding beyond 6 years, council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask just another question about the length of at least the first phase, which is that's what the $26.7 million figure is associated with, right?
It's 3.3 miles
For phase 1.
for phase 1.
Okay.
No, wait,
I think total.
that's total. So
I don't have a breakdown.
we'll have to figure out which portion is 3.3.
And again, that is a very windy, hilly street road, so understand that. Okay. But to the point that I think we all agree with as we're looking at some of these projects, and particularly this one that it was already extended beyond 6 years, to which we've agreed, I think having sometimes a per mile or some basis breakdown to put it into perspective is helpful moving forward.
For further context, this one entered the CIP in 13.
In 2013?
So it's been in the mix for quite a while without advancing.
Very good. Okay. Thank you. So we agree with recommendation? Yes, a lamented yes, I agree with that sentiment. Okay.
All right. Moving on to another new project, the Silver Spring and Bethesda Secure Bike Parking Facilities. This project will be located at the Silver Spring and Bethesda metro stations and will provide secure areas for people who bike to those stations to park their bikes. These projects are funded by a federal earmark covering 80% of the cost of these projects. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
80% covered by federal support. I think that's great.
Yep.
What's not to like? So unanimous?
Yep.
Great.
All right. Moving on to the Tuckerman Lane sidewalk. This project provides for the design and construction of pedestrian and bicycle safety improvements along the 3.8-mile section of Tuckerman Lane between Falls Road and Old Georgetown Road. The corridor improvements, this is another phased project. So you'll see the 4 phases outlined in the packet. The executive's recommendation for $537,000 in this CIP covers only the sidewalk portion of one segment of phase 1 of that project. So within that Falls Road to Seven Locks Road phase, this project funds sidewalk improvements in one segment of that project. And you can see that labeled on the map as the sidewalk project. And you'll see that covers a portion of segment 1. If the council wishes to restore the entirety of phase 1 to this project, that scenario or that alternative is reflected in the FY25 to 30 restored schedule scenario in the table contained within the packet.
Mr. Councilmember?
Sorry, was there additional information? I understand the packet was updated, but I printed out my packet before you updated it. Was there additional information?
The additional information was how exactly what the scope of a restored schedule could look like. I was able to clarify with DOT that restored schedule, that $32.1 million figure over this 6-year period would cover the full completion of phase 1 of this project.
Great. Thank you. I mean, I think in this area, I hear a great deal from residents about particularly pedestrian safety in the area. So I'd like to have this put on our list for further consideration.
I agree. Councilmember Balcombe?
Yep. Sorry.
Great.
Just to go backwards a little bit.
Yeah,
Seven
sorry.
Phase 1 was 1.5 miles.
Okay, so so Seven Locks 1.5 miles, and that was the $26.7 million.
Yes, as an old estimate.
Great. So thank you.
All right. Finally, for this subcategory, we have the US 29 pedestrian and bicycle improvements project. This project funds the design and construction of pedestrian and bicycle improvements to flash BRT stations along the US 29 corridor. The county executive recommends adding $2.4 million to this project to account for inflation and the addition of FY29 and FY30 to this level of effort project. I'll note this is one place where we'll be turning to the planning board review of the CIP, in which they recommend increased funding to this project and an accelerated project schedule, stating that the current scope of the proposed improvements is insufficient to adequately address pedestrian and bicycle needs along the US 29 corridor, citing the Bicycle Master Plan Biennial Monitoring Report. Specifically, they request the addition of 2 bikeway projects to this project, those being the Castle Boulevard Bikeway and the Tech Road Broad Birch Drive Bikeway. Council staff recommends concurring with the planning board. And if this is not one for which, because there was no tinkering with the previously approved schedule, this was not one for which council staff has provided a restored schedule expenditures, but could do so if the committee would like to see that in the future.
Thank you. Director Conklin, is this project receiving any state support?
There is some state support, and it's allocated to projects that are north of Randolph Road. We haven't assigned it to any particular effort yet. We're figuring out that work program. This project is relatively new to the CIP. And if you don't have it in front of you, but the funding schedule shows $2 million in FY24. That was the state aid that was received. It was actually just approved a couple weeks ago. So we're now beginning to work to put that money to use. So that's the answer to that question. In terms of the other two projects, they may be very worthwhile projects. They're probably out of scale with this BIPA level of effort project. The total funding for this is around $8 million. We think those elements of the planning recommended projects are both well in excess of the entire funding allocated to this project. So if council wants to pursue those, it may make sense to identify them for transportation feasibility study efforts and add a little bit of additional funding to that program, or put them into facility planning, which we've been trying to do less of. We've been trying to create less standalone high-dollar projects, not more, but that would be another way to proceed. But my sense is that those projects would dramatically outpace and outscale the amount of money available for this, which these projects that are in this BIPA have been more quick fix sidewalk traffic control, signing, marking, safety-related efforts rather than large-scale projects to change the nature of the roads. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those projects. They're just probably not at the scale of this level of effort.
Sure. Thank you. So I'll say two things. One, this section or stretch of Route 29 extends between State Legislative District 20 and 14. Do you know the state money is coming from 14 if it's north of
I think
Randolph?
that's the northern component.
Yeah. So I would assume that investment is going to the northern end of Route 29. And then to the last point you made about planning and the scope of work, there's a lot of change that's coming to that community. And I would be comfortable holding off so that we have those holistic conversations as that development occurs, so that we can work with planning, work with you to make sure that part need, part amenity is met as that development's in formation. Yeah. So we'll go along with the county executive's recommendation.
All right, that concludes the committee's review of the pedestrian facilities and bikeways subcategory. Moving on to the roads subcategory, does the committee want to look at take a closer look at any of the consent projects before moving on to a closer look at the others?
I'm okay.
I'm good.
Alex?
I'm good.
We're good, so we'll agree by consent?
Okay. Looking at facility planning roads, this project provides for planning and preliminary engineering design for new and reconstructed highway projects under consideration for inclusion in the capital improvements program. A complete list of these sub-projects can be found on circle pages 113 and 114. The executive recommends adding $100,000 each to FY25 and FY26 to develop new curbside management guidelines in coordination with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
An objection? You good?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving on to Goshen Road South. This project provides for the design and implementation of spot improvements to address safety and capacity issues along Goshen Road. This project as originally planned, would have widened Goshen Road to a 4-lane divided closed section road and included sidewalks, shared use paths, bike lanes, storm drain improvements, and street lighting. You'll see that cost reflected as the roughly $160 million figure in last year's approved CIP. Due to project costs and fiscal capacity outlook, the county executive and county council have previously directed the Department of Transportation to explore rather doing spot roadway, pedestrian, and bicycle improvements rather than the complete road redesign and widening as previously included in the scope. So this adjusted scope is reflected in this CIP, which is why you see the substantially reduced cost, where it now reflects as $4.59 million for these spot improvements and to retain the two-lane roadway. Council staff recommends concurring with the executive.
We concur.
We did learn that we received a $500,000 earmark over the weekend to support.
Federal.
Federal earmark.
Great. Thank you, Congress.
All right. Moving on to Observation Drive Extended. This project provides for the design and construction of a 2.2-mile-long roadway with a minimum 150-foot right-of-way. The work will be constructed in two phases that are outlined in the image contained within the staff report. There are also other details, although I think this committee is quite familiar with this project. The county executive recommends delaying all but the Phase 1 design and property acquisition project elements beyond the 6-year period in this CIP. This decision was made due to fiscal capacity. In addition, since the executive transmitted his recommended CIP to the council, developers along the project area have approached DOT arguing for different alignments in the Phase 2 section, both of which will affect the northern portion of the Phase 1 alignment. So MCDOT paused design until the master plan alignment decision is made by the planning board as part of the Clarksburg Gateway Sector Plan. It is anticipated that the county executive will transmit an amendment to this project along with the operating budget later this week. So council staff at this time recommends tabling the discussion of this project until we receive that amended project form with the operating budget.
Turn it over to District Councilmember.
Sure. Thank you. So this project has been around for a long time. Of course, the Clarksburg community needs this road built, and of course, we need to have, it's a major thoroughfare, and even more important considering that we don't have any plan in sight for the I-270 itself. In this regard, I understand and have been involved in the conversations about the Phase 2 and the route of Phase 2, where Phase 2 would go, where Phase 2 and Phase 1 would connect. And so I appreciate why we would need to delay for Phase 2. The only thing that I would say is that it's 2024, and I would hope that this would be built before 2031. So I think that, or at least moving before then. So I think we can wait to see what the amendment says. But this is an important road, and it hurts my heart to say let's pause, because I've been advocating for this road for a very, very long time. However, we have a sector plan going forward right now, and we don't know what the best route for this road's going to be. I think there's some general agreement that it's not the route that was in the original master plan, so it makes sense for the delay.
Councilmember Balcombe, the owners of both Phase 1 and Phase 2 property are looking for a different alignment, if that makes you feel any less pain about this.
Only a tiny bit. Thank you.
Appreciate the thoughtful comments of the District 2 council member, and if the alignment is in question and the alignment is being requested to be changed by the property owners, then we have to take that into consideration. I'll just add that for as long as I've been on the council, I have been supportive of this project despite it being removed for, I believe, every CIP from the county executive, because it is important, given the lack of transportation options, we have to provide some options. So we're agreement with this recommendation, so.
All right, and the last project that we will consider today is the Summit Avenue extension. The project provides for the extension of Summit Avenue in Kensington from Pliers Mill Road to Farragut Road, improvement of Farragut Road, and reconfiguration of the intersection of Connecticut Avenue, the intersection of Connecticut Avenue, University Boulevard, and Farragut Road. The executive recommends delaying all project components beyond 6 years due to GO bond fiscal capacity. I will note there in this packet I've included a letter from Council Vice President Stewart, Council President Andrew Friedson, and Councilmember Gabe Albornoz, as well as from the town of Kensington and from the Planning Board, all of whom have requested that this project be restored to its former schedule. This alternative is reflected again in the FY25 to 30 restored schedule row in the table contained within the staff report.
Great. Thank you for that. Before I turn it over to District Council Member, I want to recognize Mayor Furman, and I don't know if anyone else is here, but thank you.
Great. Thank you. So I'm sorry that Summit Avenue actually begins with an S, because as we're talking about all these things, alphabetically, it's at the end of the list. But I will say to my colleagues, this is one of my top priorities as we're going through the CIP, because this is much more than a roads project. This is about the local economy, housing, and connectivity for the town of Kensington. And it's not just also because this project has been talked about since 1970, around the time I was born. So, because that's the first time this was actually in the Kensington-Wheaton master plan, to actually create greater connectivity in this area. It hasn't been in the CIP that long, but it has been discussed. And I also want to just thank the town of Kensington for their commitment to this and doing the research and the groundwork and having the ULI report that was done this past year, doing the community engagement. And in the packet is also a presentation from them about what this means for the town of Kensington. And I think as we're moving forward, again, not just thinking about our roads projects, but how making these type of infrastructure changes actually can advance our housing and economic development goals is really important. So I request that the committee move this forward.
Thank you, Councilmember Stewart. Vice President Stewart, I agree with everything that you just said, because as we look at a lot of these projects, many of them are either recreational and or public safety with regard to road safety. This is a mix, and it expands the scope of a normal CIP project, where it might seem on its face that it is a simple road project, but we know that it will provide more housing and more economic activity, which makes it very different from the other projects that we have discussed today. And not that we've gotten to this point, but if we did create a hierarchy of that secondary list, this would be at the top of that list for me as well, because it really is a catch-all, a project that can do so much for the community and for the county. And so the recommendation that you're making is to restore the funding, right?
Well, the recommendation we actually wanted to make, those of us who wrote the letter, was not just even putting it back in restore, though we would love for us to have, but understanding the inflation has increased the land acquisition costs. So in our letter, we had actually requested for additional funds to make sure that we could cover the cost of the land acquisition.
So first things first, we'll add it to that
Right.
list with the note that it might need more support, financial support. Councilmember Balcombe.
Yeah, and I appreciate Council Vice President Stewart's remarks. I've been briefed on this project, and it really is so much more than a transportation project. It is economic development, it's community development, and for that matter, it is pedestrian safety, because we've got a really difficult intersection that could be resolved or partially resolved. So I'm in full support, so thank you.
Got that, Mr. Kenny?
I do, although I will note that the project expenditure schedule that you see in the staff report does reflect increased land costs.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
So this, yeah, the expenditure schedule is current.
Great.
And that's all we have for this.
That concludes the third T&E committee work session on the CIP. We have one more next week where we will try to reconcile some of these outstanding issues. Thank OMB, thank DOT. Appreciate all of your work, and we'll see you next week. Yep.
Balin?
Yeah, Councilmember Vice President Stewart is going to head to the PHP committee because her ZTA on faith-based housing is being taken up today. But let me just take a 5-minute break.
Hello?
We're leaving.
You know how to clear a room.
Okay, we are all ready. Second item on the agenda is a work session to take up the amendments to the Comprehensive Water Supply and Sewer Systems Plan and category change requests. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Levchenko and let's get into it.
Great, yeah, I put together some slides that walk us through the packet, hopefully very quickly. And we also have staff from DEP and the Planning Department here that can introduce themselves briefly before we get started. Push the button in front of you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alan Sukup. I'm with the Department of Environmental Protection.
Steve Schofar, Division Chief, Intergovernmental Affairs, Department of Environmental Protection.
I'm Jamie Pratt from the Up County Planning Division and the Planning Department.
Yeah, Patrick Butler, Up County Planning Chief. Good to see you again.
Thank you, guys.
All right, so today, let me bring the slides up. We have 11 category change requests, and I've put up the map, the bigger map that appeared in the executive staff report. Maybe not big enough for this, but the little box you see with the yellow area, that's where all but one of the requests are. And then you have another request up in the Olney area here. So 10 of the requests are down here, one of them's up here. In terms of that area we're looking at, just southwest of Rockville, the Glen Hills area, which the committee is well familiar with, at least historically the committee has been well familiar with. Ms. Balcombe has joined us later in the process. So we'll be talking about a little bit of history of that area as well. Just real quickly on the timeline and background, we did get these requests back in January. Just to reiterate, all the requests are either outside the planned sewer service envelope or have some elements of them that require discussion today. If they're within the planned sewer envelope without any issues, DEP can deal with them administratively and say yes. So we tend to get the more difficult cases and the no's. So just bringing that up now. I mentioned earlier 9 of the requests are in the Potomac subregion area, 8 within Glen Hills. 1 is in Upper Rock Creek and 1 is in Olney. I think I misspoke earlier. I think I said there were 10 in Glen Hills. There's 9. As I mentioned, we have the Planning Department staff here because the Planning Board did hear testimony and discuss the requests on February 29th and submitted a letter to the Council, which is included in the packet. And I've noted, or we can note as we go along, their recommendations. And we, of course, held a public hearing last week on this. So the public hearing testimony was also made available through links in the packet as well, and we can reference that. The category change process itself, this is part of a typical package where we get generally a couple packages a year from the executive. They receive DEP acting as the executive branch lead on this, receives requests throughout the year. Some of them can be done administratively, like I mentioned. Others have to be packaged for the council action, and so those get grouped together and sent over, as I mentioned, a couple times a year. Administratively, DEP can approve them, but there is not an administrative denial process, and that's why ones that DEP is not supportive automatically have to go through this process, as well as ones that DEP feels or other departments or agencies have noted have issues that need to be discussed. From the council's perspective, we can approve them flat out or approve them with certain conditions. We can also conditionally approve them, which means they would require some future action. They would not be approved yet, but would be signaled as to be approved once some future action occurs. Or they could be deferred pending further information that's needed, or they can just be denied. These are all part of the 10-year water and sewer plan. A category change that is approved is an amendment to the water and sewer plan. And any amendments to the plan do have to go to the Maryland Department of the Environment for final action. We had a comprehensive update to the plan that was done by this council back in October of 2022, which was later approved by MDE, but with certain policy changes. and denials of certain elements of the policy that the council had approved. So just to, make clear that the council's actions on amendments are tentative pending final action by MDE. And just to note, generally speaking, when we have actions that come to the council, often these cases involve exceptional policies that are in the plan, and so we'll be referring to those policies as we go forward. And particularly this time around, the peripheral sewer policy, which is a policy within the Potomac subregion that has elements that affect a lot of these cases. As I mentioned, we have the Glen Hills area with 8 requests in this package, and this has a long history. The current master plan was approved in 2002, and it called for a septic study of the Glen Hills area, which was later completed in 2013. As a result of that study, the council did make some changes to some restrictions in the Glen Hills area. Prior to that study, Glen Hills was under pretty restrictive circumstances, even more so than other areas outside the planned envelope. What the council did after the survey was basically put Glen Hills on par with other areas outside the planned envelope. But as you'll see today, it did not go as far as applicants within Glen Hills wanted or needed in order for their properties to potentially qualify. So we'll be talking about some of those elements today. Another issue within the 2018 water and sewer plan update, the council approved allowing the peripheral sewer service policy in Potomac to also apply to Glen Hills. Before that, it had been restricted. So not only is Glen Hills treated like the rest of the county in terms of qualifying out for, in certain cases, outside the sewer envelope, it does also have that particular policy in Potomac that it can be eligible for. And that's why we'll be discussing that in more detail today. The other issue that is related to this is septic surveys themselves. Prior to 2018 update, these surveys could be initiated by DEP based on their assessment of an area that needed study. Generally, applicants would come in expressing concern about their systems. There could be failures or it could just be concerns about failures. DEP would look at the area, not just the one property, but a logical area that could be served by an extension and determine whether it was reasonable to consider a broader category change serving that area. And we've had a number of those cases over the years. In 2018, the council tightened that policy up to require that there be at least one failure within that area that is defined. And that did have an implication in Glen Hills, where there was a study going on that had started, but there was no failure in that area identified. And so that study was dropped. And some of the cases today are actually in or near that survey area. So let me just, this is actually the survey area, and I've got some of the cases listed here. We'll get into more detail later. Regarding the peripheral sewer service policy, because of the somewhat unique nature of the Potomac subregion and the master plan approval in 2002, you have a bit of a mix of properties that had moved forward with sewer prior to 2002 and other properties that hadn't and could not after 2002. So you have a bit more of a checkerboard pattern of areas that have service and areas that don't. And the peripheral sewer service policy was an attempt to provide some means to fill in some of these gaps along the edge of the planned sewer envelope. And as I mentioned, certain areas were excluded from that, including Glen Hills, although it was later restored by the council as being eligible in that. Three of the cases today were previously deferred, and we'll talk about them in a little more detail later. But the council, in its 22 plan update, added language to affirm that the city of Rockville's sewer area, planned sewer area, was not part of the determination of whether someone was qualifying under this peripheral sewer service policy. It clarified that the plan itself was focused on the county's sewer service area, not the city of Rockville's. And MDE ultimately did approve that change in the 22 update. These three cases are now back, and the executive is recommending denial based on that, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So when we get into the individual requests, we'll have some discussion of each request as well as a map to show where they are. And we also have executive staff and planning department folks here to speak to their recommendations. In some cases, there are some differences or some nuances or further discussion that the planning board had that went beyond just the up and down vote on each of the requests. So we'll try to touch on that as well. So the first request in the packet is TRV 14A. I've got the basic information on this slide, and this follows the packet. So just trying to keep us on track with the packet. It's a 1.87 acre RE1 zoned property located at Watts Branch Drive in the Glen Hills study area, as I mentioned. The applicant is seeking S3, or basically approval to have public sewer extended to serve an existing single-family home. The property does abut several other properties which were approved for public sewer as part of an earlier septic study that through that process I had mentioned earlier. But it is important to note, and this is noted in the executive staff report, that when there are exceptions made and services provided to a property, that does not mean that those new properties are now part of the planned sewer envelope. If we did that, then there would be no end, as properties would always then abut the next set of properties. So the original planned sewer envelope is based on the master plan recommendations and corrections that are made along the way. But when exceptions are made for certain policies like this, you may get additional properties served that are still considered outside the planned envelope. And that's the case with these abutting properties. So in this case, the property does not meet the qualifications for being adjacent to the planned sewer service envelope, which is the only way this property would qualify, since it does not have a failing septic system. And it's not part of a overall study area that's as part of that. So the executive had recommended denial, and the planning board had concurred, as does council staff.
Thank you for that overview and background, Mr. Lovchenko. I can't say I disagree with the recommendations, but I have a broader question. I think I've brought this up every time we have these discussions. Why is the policy that we have to wait for failure before we try to do something?
Well, actually, that's a good point. And I did note in the packet, if the council was interested in a more proactive approach, whether in specific areas of the county or in broader areas of the county, there are a couple of things the council could do. What staff would not recommend is making exceptions to specific category changes, because then a couple problems. One, we don't know what the precedent is set by doing that, but also it's very likely MDE would have problems if we were to make exceptions to our own policies, and they would very likely deny them. So the better approach, if we're looking at a more proactive means of dealing with aging septic systems, such as what you heard at the public hearing in some areas of Glen Hills, one, you could consider a limited master plan amendment to that area. That is something the council had asked of the planning board about 7 years ago to consider. That's part of the planning board's work plan, and a limited master plan amendment looking at sewer issues in Potomac could be the subject of that. And that's certainly one way that these issues could be reviewed again. Another area, short of a master plan amendment, would be to revisit the septic sewer area policy of looking at particular areas. As I mentioned, The policy originally gave DEP a fair amount of latitude to do that proactive review that you just mentioned. But requiring a failure in a particular area means that you are a bit stuck if there are no failures. You can't just go in and do a study. So you do have to wait for a failure. So less proactive than the old approach. So another option that the council could choose is to revisit that policy and allow for a little more flexibility to do that earlier look at properties, whether it's in Glen Hills or countywide, and consider what requirements you might have short of a failure to instigate a study of an area. And once that area is studied, of course, part of that study is how would it be served? Is it feasible to serve it? And then if you do have the benefit of an area, then it's possible that area itself could work together to help finance that type of the extension need that would be required to serve them.
Sure. Appreciate those ideas for future consideration. But what's before us right now, I'll agree with all the other recommendations and support the denial.
Thank you. I will too, but I do want to go back to the issue of the planned public sewer envelope. I feel like there's a little bit of a glitch there in that. So the exceptions that have happened in the past, I would assume that one of the factors that was taken into consideration is the fact that they did abut the planned sewer envelope, right? So it's almost like if your property happens to be just the one property that abuts the planned envelope, then you get your sewer, or other factors have to be the same. So I think it's kind of it seems to be a little bit of a glitch, but I understand that if we don't have some limitation, then it's just a chain event and every property would go. But I do think that there's a level of unfairness there, and maybe I'm not understanding it correctly.
Well, in the past, we have had a fairly steady stream of properties that have been eligible under this. So in some cases, yes, there's just one property sitting out there and it's surrounded and it's an easy call. Other ones they're adjacent to the envelope, but as is the whole street. And so a whole street could choose if it's a property owner's decision, they could choose under the peripheral sewer policy to apply. But one neighborhood over, as you're sort of saying, they would not. That just because that set of properties was qualifying does not mean that the next road over would qualify unless they had an adjacency separate from the new adjacency they get to those new properties. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's an element of geography here, but the idea was to try to respect the lines of the planned area, mm-hmm. but provide some flexibility on the edges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that it's this was written a long time ago, but it's either the edge or it's not the edge. Then to go one abutting just seems just a little bit squishy.
Right.
So
and we do have a case here where the property is very, very close to abutting, and the executive would recommend denial because it did not abut. There may be some special circumstances with it, and that's why I was recommending a deferral, but they are about as close as you can be without abutting.
Okay.
So that does happen.
Put a pin on that, and we'll.
Yeah, and I concur with the chair on the first property that we looked at. I just think it's an issue that we should think about long term. Thank you.
The next request also, and it raises some of these issues that you may be talking about with the peripheral policy. We have a property on Foxden Court, once again in the Glen Hills study area. It has the ability to connect through a neighboring property behind it through a private easement. But the peripheral sewer policy, as written and as its intent and as implemented by DEP, the intention is to follow public rights of way and also to not open up new neighborhoods to service. So in this case, the council had previously denied the neighboring property to this one a couple of years ago, and there's several other properties in this area that had also been subject to category changes in the past. So the executive recommended denial of this as well. The planning board concurred based on how the policy has been implemented, but in the chair's letter had suggested that there should be further consideration to providing some flexibility, given that often you are dealing with old septic systems in the area, and there could be some county benefit to providing that additional flexibility. Once again, the policies are not set up that nuanced. That's the kind of issue we probably have to get into in a text amendment to the plan to try to work out those details and avoid unintended consequences and precedents we don't want. But in this case, the policy is pretty clear that you can't be served through a private easement from another neighborhood in this policy. I think Mr. Sukup wanted to add something.
If there were a case such as this, where there was a confirmed failure of a septic system and no other way to deal with it, then we would look at that easement issue through the intervening properties. As a matter of fact, the property at the north end of the street here, at the north, further north. Yeah, there we go. Okay. That is a case where there was a septic failure, and the property owner was able to acquire a easement through an intervening property to get access to that sewer main on Jasmine Hill Terrace. So they're not cut off completely, but there needs to be a documented reason for making that change.
And continuing with this map, this property in particular, the one in question, it's a backdoor way it's being proposed, right? Literally through the backyard. Does that, if that were to be granted, much like the property at the north end of the map that Mr. Sukup you referenced, that does not unlock the rest of the neighborhood?
In this case, no. What they would be looking for is an easement for their own service connection, not a mainline extension.
Got it. Okay.
But if you were to approve this one, it does beg the question, why would we not approve this one?
So that's
or this one?
correct. So that's the point I'm getting at. And
There are 3 other properties here that could make use of that same technique.
yeah.
And again, we would not look at those unless there was some kind of failure.
Right. And if I'm listening to Councilmember Balcombe correctly, and I tend to listen to you correctly, I listen to you. There's clearly interest among the two of us to look into this further, and recognizing that what we're dealing with today are the rules that exist today, but there's interest in updating them. So.
Right. I mean, for example, if one of these properties had a septic system that was 75 years old and met the criteria at the time, but arguably had issues with it in terms of how it was functioning in what would be a present-day environment, is that a rationale? That could be, there could be some sort of rationale developed there, but that rationale doesn't exist now. So as Mr. Sukup mentioned, it has to be a documented failure that DPS has noted, has documented for us.
Right. So we'll concur with the CE and the Planning Board.
Now, this is another peripheral sewer request, but actually, in this case, the staffs and planning board and executive are recommending approval. There's actually a correction to an existing property adjacent to this one that itself was found to be in the planned sewer service envelope and on WSSC sewer. So based on that, this property, which, but for that correction, would not meet the criteria, does have an immediate adjacency to the envelope, and all the parties reviewing this are now recommending approval of this one.
Right.
Will concur.
All right, this request is the one I mentioned earlier to Ms. Balcombe's concern. It actually involves two properties owned in common ownership for two unimproved lots. And I'll bring up the map here. These are the two unimproved lots. This is actually part of the planned sewer service envelope. However, there is a strip of land here that at one time was privately owned that prevents this property from claiming to be adjacent to the sewer envelope. If this property is not adjacent and can't be served, then this one can't tag along with it either as a property in the same ownership. However, if this strip of land, which was privately owned by a gas company, if it is now in public ownership, and we are researching that issue now, then under the peripheral sewer policy conditions, arguably it is adjacent to the sewer envelope.
Or confronts.
Or it confronts the sewer envelope, just as it would if it was across the street. We do allow properties where the envelope's on one side of the street and the house is on the other. That is considered eligible in the policy as confronting the envelope. So this property would fall under that if this little wedge of property were considered to be a right-of-way, essentially, rather than a piece of private land between those two properties. So staff here is recommending that we defer it. If we actually can find this information out in time for the council action, perhaps we could take it up at council. But right now, given what we don't know, we're recommending deferral to get more information.
I'm hearing some technical terms. So abut and confront, they are different.
Thank you.
Abutting means that they share a property line.
Adjacent, yes.
Right, adjacent. And then confronting means that it's across a public right-of-way, usually a road right-of-way. But as we found here, that these are now designated as, this property is now designated as a right-of-way in the county's property records. And so we're trying to figure out what that means exactly. Is it under county ownership, whatever.
Right, and the other issue we need to look at is, have these properties been in continuous ownership back to 2002? Because if they have, then this second property would also be eligible.
Which utility owned that strip?
Was the Maryland Gas Transportation Company?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That's information that we found out from looking at the original record plat for the neighborhood.
Wow. Okay. So I agree that we got to look into this further.
Completely, yeah.
Great.
But that's a good example also, from a policy standpoint. Where would we draw a line if we were to revisit this policy? What if you're 20 feet from being adjacent, or what if you're 100 feet? Or where do you draw that line? And this property is a sort of a stark reminder that right now there is no distance. If you're not adjacent and you don't confront a right of way that is adjacent, then you don't meet the policy. All right, here's another request, TRV 04A. This also involves an unimproved RE1 zone property, also in the Glen Hills study area. I think this case is a little bit more straightforward. It does not abut a sewer main, and it's not adjacent or confronting the planned sewer service area, so it's not eligible under the peripheral sewer service policy. So there is not there is no policy for properties such as this outside the planned service area other than a failure. And as an unimproved property, it can't have a failure. So the only way this property could be served under the current conditions would be if there was a broader survey done of the area and there was a failure somewhere and they got pulled into that survey area. That would be the only way under current policies that a property like this could be pulled in. So all the parties reviewing this would recommend denial of this request.
I'll support those recommendations. Yep, we will.
Okay, now we have a little bit of different item. We have a set of multiple RE2 zoned properties totaling about 11.09 acres, located on a couple of different addresses on Trevilla Road near the intersection with Royal Manor Way, in the Rockville area within the, not Rockville City, but the Rockville area within the Potomac Subregion Master Plan. It's a little confusing because one of the parcels is seeking public water, whereas the other two parcels, maybe help me out, Alan, already have public water approval.
The other two parcels were approved under what we call the abutting mains policy, which means that they are adjacent or they are abutting an existing main, and they're eligible for a single sewer connection only to that main. This was done to prevent substantial new subdivision along the alignment of a sewer main going through a lower density development area. The area to the north is higher density, it's R200. The area to the south is RE2.
So you have the water issue on this one parcel, so it's seeking public water, but the applicant is also seeking public sewer on the other parcel. I'm sorry, on the other two parcels.
Without restrictions.
And those other two parcels are outside the planned sewer service area, and we already talked about they already have water. In this case, the applicant is seeking to develop a senior living townhome community, and I do have a picture here. This is a map of the lots or the parcels. Mm-hmm. This is the planned townhome community. The issue here is how does this fit within the peripheral sewer service policy? And here we had a difference of opinion between the executive and the planning board. It is unusual. I can't remember another case where we had a development like this seeking service through the peripheral sewer service policy. But the peripheral sewer service policy itself does not distinguish and say that it is only for single-family residential. So we have the vagary of the language versus what we have normally seen occur, and the fact that you are talking about significant development with significant imperviousness, maybe not originally envisioned as being the result of this policy. So we do have a difference of opinion between the executive and planning board staff on this, so I thought it'd be helpful to hear from both for the committee's benefit today on this request. Do you want to start, Alan?
Yeah, we'll be the bad cops on this one. Because this type of situation had not been previously encountered with the peripheral service policy, everything we have done previous to this has been for single-family housing. By and large, one existing lot. We felt that there was no precedent for this type of development in the peripheral service policy. That's not to say that it couldn't be done, but that kind of a precedent would need to be established by the council.
How so?
And so our recommendation was to deny, but to bring it forward to the council for consideration and to see how far the council was wanted to take this existing policy. If the council has an interest in moving this forward, then what we may need to do is, as part of our next update of the plan, we may need to craft some language for the policy that makes it broader to include this kind of situation.
So thank you for that. Mr. Levchenko, is that in the form of a resolution or regulatory change? Or I'm trying to figure out the vehicle to clarify the ambiguity.
We can bring it forward as part of the next update of the water and sewer plan, which is what we're working on right now.
And that would be delivered when?
2025, next year. Or we could work on a separate text amendment that we could bring forward to the plan out of the update cycle, the 3-year update cycle.
Let me ask a different question, because I don't have the language in front of me. The code that you're referring to, how does it refer to these properties?
Well,
Well, I'm trying to hone in on what's ambiguous, right? Because to me, a residentially zoned property is a residentially zoned property, regardless if it's single-family, multifamily, townhouse, right? I feel comfortable at this point in time understanding that language and allowing it to move forward. If it is some other language that we need to hone in on, but if it has been interpreted as residential, this certainly is residential.
Right. And again, as sometimes happens with water and sewer plans, special policies like this, the understanding is one thing, the actual wording is another. As we found with some policies that we worked on with the last update in 2022, we always prefer to work from a standpoint of specificity. And
That, does it specify single-family homes?
no,
Okay. Then I will restate that residential means residential,
right.
and that this would classify as residential.
And looking at the planning board's recommendation on this, after some discussion, there is a requirement for a conditional use approval on this site that typically would go first to clarify that the land use decision on this has been made, that it is an acceptable use for this property or these properties. We don't have that at the moment.
If this were a request for a single-family home, it would be approved, right?
Yes.
Would it be approved before the planning board approved any designs?
It
elements?
would most likely be approved as an administrative case for each of these parcels. And as a matter of fact, it probably, given the circumstances, if they're only looking for one house on each of these properties, it would fit under the existing category change restrictions. We wouldn't even be here. This is because they're talking about multiple units, multiple housing units on these properties, and that doesn't factor into the existing restriction.
The executive branch is receiving conflicting messages on how to move forward. You're seeking clarity from the council.
Right.
Right. So I'll say that I am comfortable with this moving forward at this point in time, and would like to work with you to further clarify and codify that decision.
Okay.
Now, let me, I didn't get to my staff record.
We beat you to it, Keith.
First, you've heard a few things. One, I think from the planning board's perspective, they feel that this is within the purview of the peripheral sewer policy and you could move forward.
Yeah.
That's not to say that clarifying language later is a bad idea. I mean,
We can do both.
We see that the policy is vague here. Let's clean that up for next time. But I think the board's opinion is you don't have to wait for that. Staff also doesn't think you need to necessarily wait for that either. However, as Mr. Sukup mentioned, I think there is a precedent to wait for the conditional approval to happen. We could defer the request pending the conditional approval. When that conditional approval happens, it can then be a fairly quick turnaround here, but we try not to get ahead of the land use whenever we can. So
I'll turn it over to planning. Can you talk us through, and I'm sorry, yeah, Councilmember Balcombe, do you want to
thanks.
follow up on that?
Just because it might come in handy. I appreciate that. Thank you. One of my questions was, is that a circular argument with the conditional use? Would the question be asked of whether this has adequate sewer? And if so, it's just a circular argument, so.
Yeah, so you're asking all the right questions. I'll say you clearly are understanding the issue here. And I think in general, we agree with the approach that I think it would be fine to recommend approval of this extension subject to the necessary land use approval. There is a little bit of a nuance here that you're obviously picking up on with the conditional use, it being multiple units, not one, which while it's not, specifically in conflict with the policy, it's not traditionally what has been done. But I would say a little more traditional, a little more consistent with past practice. There are some nuanced cases like this with unique circumstances where the council has granted approval of that extension subject to approval of some subsequent land use action. So I would say in that case, this is really not unique in that respect. It would be consistent with what previous councils have done. And correct me if I'm wrong, and any of the staff that have been doing this longer than me, but that.
The council's, I think, done it both ways in the past. Go ahead.
And to your argument or question about circular reasoning, that, the chicken and the egg thing has come up here before. And typically when the hearing examiner wants, feels, oh, well, the category issue should be resolved or the service issue should be resolved, what we have provided for the hearing examiner is a report that explains that service can be provided. There's no question about that here. The water and sewer mains are available. It's just that the use is unusual, and so we are looking for the conditional use action. This is subject to zoning text amendment that was approved, I think, about 2 years ago, to allow this kind of elder housing or senior housing in lower density zones. So we can provide the hearing examiner with information from this request that explains that service can be provided if this goes forward.
Sure. And Mr. Sukup, your reference to decisions made 2 years ago. There was a decision 2 years ago also to adopt the planning board's Thrive program, right, which upends some of our decades of thinking of land use, right? And while we are still working on implementation, this might be the very first sewer category change that we would have to take up as it relates to our goals. And so I absolutely understand the reason we're having this conversation, right? It's a really healthy one. I think we need to move forward, right? Residential is residential. And if it is not the type of residential we have traditionally thought of, well, it's the year 2024. And there's always time for change. But agree with the sensible consideration of waiting for the planning board to make its, what was specific approval?
Right, well, they will make a recommendation. The hearing examiner will approve the conditional use.
Sure.
Right, I guess the question is, and you end up at the same place, but are we deferring it pending conditional use approval, or are we approving it conditioned on conditional use approval? In one case, it comes back. In the other case, it doesn't.
So I just need to understand a little bit. So if we approve it without waiting for the conditional use, if, for instance, the conditional use didn't go forward, then it's a moot point, because it's not as if we're going to hook into the sewer.
This becomes null.
Right, this becomes null. So I feel like I just don't want the hearing examiner to, there's a difference in saying the service can be provided versus the service is provided. I mean, and I don't know the nuance enough for the hearing examiner whether that would be taken into consideration.
Okay. Time for nuances. One thing that we have tried to do over the years, and I've been here a lot of years, is to not overly influence the decision of the hearing examiner or some other function by having a council approval or conditional approval on a category change request. That is nuanced, obviously. And that is the way we've typically done it, but there are exceptions. If there's a desire to move this forward without any additional delay. So what would happen in this case is that if you grant a conditional approval, that requires the hearing examiner's approval of the conditional use request and the planning board's approval of a subdivision plan, because that's fairly typical in a case like this, then you're done with this case unless some substantial change comes back and we need to talk about it again. Once those conditions are satisfied, DEP will finalize the category change and submit that to the state for approval.
And it doesn't have to come back up.
It doesn't have to come back to you.
So I'm still caught up on the point that residential is residential. And I don't think I want to condition that, right? We as a council, our legislative priority is to encourage more residential. And that's in our zoning and Thrive. And if this fits that category, it fits the category, conditionally or not, or unconditionally. And so I feel absolutely comfortable approving this and letting the other processes work its will. And if it becomes null, it becomes null. I don't think we're tilting the scales in any way by saying we support residential, because all of our laws, all of our zoning supports this already. It's just the first time it would be implemented this way. That's not tilting the scales, that's just change. And so I would recommend that we support approval.
I concur.
Great.
So approval with, well, so not requiring anything else to happen before you approve, approving now. But when we do approve these, we do typically approve with, I'm going to write the right terms, approve subject to approval, the conditional approval and a preliminary subdivision plan.
Well, but as
They're not-
discussed, those next steps have to happen in order to unlock this, right? So why would we condition it?
Well, and part of it also is, and this has happened maybe more with PIF requests, the council likes to see what is actually going to be built when they approve something, and could be concerned if there's a significant change in what's going to be built later, even though it still might theoretically, meet the criteria to go forward. How much control does the council want to have over what's going to be built there?
I will speak for myself and say I support residential.
There can be a requirement that we put in the resolution that the final plan approval needs to be largely consistent with the plan that you have seen today. That's not unusual.
We haven't, I'll turn it over to planning, but we haven't gotten into even the specifics of the plan. To me, that's secondary, because if it already meets the criteria for hookup, it is somewhat secondary what the actual design might be.
I'm just going to take a stab at what I'm hearing and see if
Yeah.
that resonates with council staff. So I'm hearing approval of a residential project, and I think getting to your point, that would not include institutional uses, any non-residential uses that may be permitted as either conditional use or some other form in that zone. That's not what the council, or excuse me, the T&E committee would be recommending approval of today. It would be residential, and yes, a little more broadly than we've done in the past.
Sounds good, Mr. Butler.
And not conditioned on a preliminary subdivision plan, it sounds like.
That's not what I'm hearing. I'm hearing a residential, it's being recommended to be extended for residential use. And then that specific use, whether it's a single-family detached home, townhouse development, et cetera, as long as it's residential.
We're not changing the zoning. The zoning
Correct.
is up to the planning board. If this, and the council ultimately, but if this is already zoned and it is allowable and it is residential and it fits the code, let's move forward.
And then if the conditional use is denied, this is not.
Then we just wasted 30 minutes.
Someone has to come back with a new request.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly, right.
There is, in terms of the water and sewer plan, I don't see any problem with wording that says this is for residential use only.
Right.
Absolutely.
Super.
All right.
Great.
Our next request is a request actually not in the Potomac subregion, an RE2 zoned property on Muncaster Mill Road north of the intersection with Achille Lane in the Upper Rock Creek master plan area. And here the applicant is seeking to build a 100-unit senior living facility. There's currently a single-family home on the property. Now, unlike in the Potomac subregion, we don't have a peripheral sewer policy that's countywide. That's only in Potomac. So this property is outside the planned envelope, and there is no exceptional policy that we have in place to approve it at this point. Once again, that's something the council could look at. The planning board noted that this property is very close to the nearby sewer in this area, but we don't have a policy to hang our hat on with this one. So if we were to make an exception for it, I think we would probably run into trouble at the state. So once again, we get into this nuance of what do we want to allow and where, and how do we set those guardrails? And it's hard to do it when you get a particular case in front of you. It's something that you more likely have to do as a more thoughtful text amendment to the plan if the council's interested. But with all those notes, the planning board and the executive concurred that based on the current policies, this property is ineligible to be approved.
I concur with the recommendations.
Yes.
Okay.
And we do have one private institutional facilities request in this package. The applicant seeking both public water and sewer. This is actually in the Olney area off Old Baltimore Road. The applicant's intending to build a 700-seat church. You did hear a testimony from a representative of the applicant at the public hearing. You might recall that. According to executive staff, it meets the requirements to be considered under the PIF policy in terms of the applicant being a eligible 501c3, water and sewer being available to the property without opening up service to other ineligible properties. Here, the issue is one that the council's taken up in the past, and this is where we do get at looking at some of the conceptual issues of the development. The council has been concerned in the past about imperviousness of past PIF requests, and there's a lot of discussion in the packet about this, and a number of areas in the county where PIFs have been locating have been in areas where there are impervious area caps or concerns about imperviousness, and so the council has tried to be thoughtful about working with the applicant to try to come up with a reasonable level of imperviousness. In this case, the property does straddle two different watersheds or sub-watersheds. Let me see if I have, this is a map. This is a concept plan of the church. Trying to see if I have, okay. Trying to see if there's a better map of the two watersheds. But the northern part of the property is in the Northwest Branch watershed. Oh, sorry. Other way around, I'm sorry. Hollings River tributary is in the northern part of the property. And there is a primary management area recommendation in that area that does call for, recommends 10% imperviousness or less. Now, this property does meet that for that portion of the watershed. However, in the Northwest Branch watershed, which is the southern portion, it has significantly higher imperviousness estimated based on the concept plan of about 47%. And that's where the executive staff report talks about whether that's too high given past approvals by the council. And you also heard from the applicant's representative contending that some of those past approvals were in areas that also had much lower imperviousness caps. And I've noted some of that discussion in my packet as well. The applicant's representative did proffer a revised imperviousness in the watershed that they felt would still allow the request to go forward without, I guess, a major change in the concept plan of bringing the impervious down. Let me see if I have that here. Yeah, bringing the impervious down to about 30% overall, it would be about 42% in the Northwest Branch and still fit within the 10% in the Hollings River portion of the site. And I'll speak briefly for the Planning Board here. The Planning Board was supportive of the request, but deferred to the Council on the level of imperviousness it was comfortable with, but assuming that you would stay within the 10% limit for the Hollings River. So a little bit more ambivalent about the Northwest Branch. The executive recommendation was a 25% imperviousness overall, and
In Hollings.
in Haulings.
No,
10% Haulings,
Northwest Branch.
25% in Northwest Branch,
Which is the southern part.
the southern part.
Yeah.
That's why this gets confusing.
Yeah.
Staff's supportive of a couple things. One, I did look at some of the past decisions that the council had made in other areas and did confirm that there were impervious area caps in place there that did drive a lot of that. We don't have that with Northwest Branch. The other thing is, in many of these cases, the applicant did proffer an imperviousness that could still work for their request. And we've gotten that in this case as well. So staff's recommendation is that we accept the applicant's alternative that was raised at the hearing, that we're still getting at the 10% in the Hollings River portion. That meets the criteria. It does bring the Northwest Branch down to about 42%. But once again, there's no impervious area cap there like there were in a couple of the other cases we looked at. So I think we do need to balance how the council has dealt with this before in terms of working with the applicant, not just laying out an arbitrary imperviousness, but trying to develop one that still allowed the PIF request to move forward in a reasonable manner. So staff is comfortable with the applicant's alternative that was proffered at the public hearing.
Let me ask a very baseline question. Why is the impervious level in this part of the law, right? Why is it not in any other aspects, whether it's, the site plan or anything else?
Well, the imperviousness is not part of the PIF policy other than it's discussion of the impacts. The PIF policy provides a minimum that the applicant has to meet in order to be eligible, but then it's left up to the council some discretion as to whether to approve or not. The council has identified imperviousness, especially in some of these more sensitive areas that we're talking about, as a key issue where we don't want to arbitrarily just blast through an impervious cap for any PIF request. We want to have a more rational discussion. But otherwise, the impervious caps we're talking about, they exist in master plan recommendations or zoning text amendments. They don't exist, they're not created or have not been created to date in the water and sewer plan.
Well, and that's my question, right? And so in some respects, I think personally, I think it's a policy that should be determined in other areas, but I understand the historical nature of wanting to make sure that water that is in a certain property is able to be retained, right? We just talked about stormwater management, last week. Fully understand the importance there and recognize the goal, but as you just noted, Mr. Lovchenko, not every part of the county is the same, and this part of Olney is not the same as some of the other areas of the county where there are more streams that run through, right, more regularly across neighborhoods. Okay, very interesting.
So what you have before you is you've got, staff's recommendation of the applicant's alternative. The CE recommendation was noted there, the 25% overall. No, it used the 25% in overall. No, Northwest.
In Northwest Branch.
I think I wrote that wrong.
Oh.
And then you have the applicant's preliminary plan, which was the 47% in the Northwest Branch, about 35% overall, with the 10% being consistent across for the Hollings River portion of the site.
So just keeping it apples to apples, for, the applicant's plan is 47% impervious for the Northwest Branch. The CE is agnostic on that, but wants 25% overall. Is that
25% in Northwest.
okay, Northwest Branch.
That's the typo in the.
Got it, okay, yeah. So 47% to 25%, and then the applicant has negotiated down to 42%. Okay. This is a fun one, I'm looking at you.
I know. Well, so I'm getting my, pervious, impervious, so mixed up. So the county executive is saying 25% maximum
Impervious.
maximum impervious. The applicant is saying that he or she wants 30%.
42.
Well, they want 42 at the northwest branch. Oh, and that 25% is. So we're saying that, so the applicant is asking for considerably more impervious surface. Okay, and then, I was thinking it was the other way around, right? So going back to the law, or, what do we require for imperviousness in this area?
There is the limit mentioned for Hollings River in the primary management area recommendations of 10%, but there is no imperviousness noted for the northwest branch portion of this site.
Yeah, thank you, which goes back to the question of,
Why here?
yeah, why are we determining imperviousness here in terms of, the question before us is, whether they get the water sewer that they're requesting. Why are we determining imperviousness with this discussion?
Well, in the past, and there have been requests that have been in conflict with impervious area caps in certain areas, but that also got the council interested in the general issue. Imperviousness becomes a proxy measure of environmental impact, and this would be much more intense development than you would otherwise see on this property if it wasn't going to be a PIF.
Right.
So I think the 25%, the 42%, I mean, these are, what you can say is you're probably going to have less impact with a lower imperviousness, but there is no right number per se here.
And so historically, we've imposed the impervious limitations?
Imposed might be a little strong. Typically, the council has had some back and forth with the applicant, who has then agreed to work within a certain level of imperviousness, and the council has agreed with that.
This is why back in the 2018 water and sewer plan update, we are now requiring the applicant to submit a concept plan for the project so that you can see what's being proposed. You have something concrete, so to speak, to deal with. And so while we hope that, what the applicant presents is acceptable to you, we recognize that it may or may not be. We were looking at prior cases in the same watershed, along with the same sub-watershed, where the council or the applicant had agreed to a much lower level of imperviousness. Sometimes that was to adjust their plan. Other times what they did was acquire more property that would be under their control. So that's why the executive has recommended to 25%. It was keeping with what seemed to be the council's train of thought on these types of cases. And again, when you have a PIF type use, you frequently get much more impervious area than you would for similar residential development under this zone. It's not to say that it can't be dealt with, it can't be controlled, but we know that when you start getting above 8 to 10% impervious area, despite the best stormwater water quality and water quantity controls, you start to see some degradation. This is a relatively small piece of land. It's not the entire watershed or sub-watershed. So unfortunately, again, if you want to address the imperviousness issue, you have the opportunity here. If you don't, then we can go forward with what the applicant has presented.
Yeah, I guess for me, it just seems arbitrary that we would accept, that we would require 25. The county executive suggesting 25. It just seems arbitrary that we would say 42 is okay without having guidelines, without having,
I'll just quickly try to recap from the planning board's perspective. So staff had reviewed the Olney master plan. There are specific recommendations with environmental concerns. There's not a recommendation for any impervious limit in that side of the property. And so the board, I really was trying to acknowledge that there has been some action by council previously within the area regarding imperviousness, and was just deferring back to the council saying, we're not seeing any legal reason to do this from the master plan perspective, but wanted to defer to you if you all still felt it was necessary. So,
do you impose impervious caps?
well, when there are special protection areas, for instance, the PMA, and there are instances where, yeah, there is an imperviousness limit that is agreed upon and that is written into plans or various policies, and in some cases, the overlay zones themselves within the law, within the zoning ordinance, will specifically call out a level of imperviousness that's allowed. So we do have those instances, and we're just saying that's not the case here. So I think the planning board decided to, again, defer that piece of the conversation to you all.
So I have right here, and Councilmember Balcombe sees it, I was going to ask what this is zoned. I mean, because to me, that's where this conversation really should be determined, or the question should be determined.
It's RNC, a rural neighborhood cluster. The master plan's original recommendations for this particular site hoped that they would combine with the adjacent RNC subdivision and make use of that density. They did not do that, so this is really too small a site to use the RNC cluster option. It's very difficult to cluster a single use.
Was that discussed at the planning board? Or that concern? If what I'm hearing is a concern?
I don't believe that specific part of the conversation was discussed. It was more in considering what the applicant was proposing rather than what the zone allowed and what they could do under the zone. But correct me if I'm wrong. That's my memory anyway. I don't think we talked about what they could do today in that zone.
I mean, religious institutions are allowed by use in any zone.
Sure.
So they meet the zoning criteria. So it becomes then, you have other issues that the council has dealt with in the past in terms of community impact, consistency with the rest of the neighborhood, imperviousness. Those are the kinds of issues that have come up in the past.
So
There are other nonprofit uses along this section of Old Baltimore Road.
Mm-hmm. So Mr. Butler referenced that within the only master plan or whatever the last item was, it made really no reference to the impervious aspect of development. You're looking through it right now, but let me broaden it out and ask, how does the impervious requirements change with other master plans, right? And this is the point we're both hitting on, right? If it is noted in zoning code in different areas of the county that they require different levels, that is what should dictate this conversation.
Yeah, so there are different impervious limits, and they're unique to a particular area of the county, just like you're alluding to and suspecting. You're correct. So we do take a area-specific approach to that particular area of the county, and there are different factors that go into why less imperviousness or more imperviousness may be allowed in that particular area. That is sort of a master plan by master plan basis when we get into that community and that particular unique circumstances and do our analysis and of course hear public testimony and consider those recommendations and concerns as well that lead us to formulating a recommendation that we then carry forward with you for a final decision. So
Has this project been approved by planning?
this one now. Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, I could read
Yeah,
just
please.
a little bit of the Olney master plan
Yeah,
that
Mr. Pratt.
addresses this. The application of the RNC zone also allows more units to be constructed with less imperviousness than the existing zoning would have yielded. While some benefits would result from application of a special protection area with an 8% imperviousness cap, it would not significantly reduce the potential imperviousness in this subwatershed, nor likely affect the overall stream conditions. An SPA or overlay zone with an imperviousness cap is not recommended in this area. So the master plan is basically saying there's not enough that can change in the broad picture for imperviousness. It is a concern in the master plan, but they just recommended protecting stream buffers and wetlands.
What's the specific master plan?
That's the only master plan,
When was it last approved?
2005.
2005. Okay.
And that was also assuming that it would be developed at that density. It wasn't assuming that.
I caught that, yes. So that the use as noted is not exact, or as hoped for is not exactly what it, yeah, I get it.
And then one other thing I did want to note, PIF requests do tend to be denser uses on lower density type of zoned land. One of the suggestions I had also as part of my recommendation was to also include that the applicant, as part of the preliminary plan process with the planning board, include, and I have it up here, all appropriate best management water quality practices to the maximum extent practicable, and that the planning board work with the applicant to further reduce imperviousness in the Northwest Branch portion. So things can still change as they move from where they are now to a full preliminary plan approval. And one of the things, we've talked about in the past, especially with churches, you have large parking lots.
Yep.
Perhaps you could do pervious paving to some degree, like we
Well,
have at
so,
some of our facilities.
so that's the point, right? I absolutely agree with you, but we can't negotiate that now, and we can't make that conditional. That's planning, which is why I'm trying to use them as the vehicle to make the project even better.
Says have them try to work it out at that next level of review.
So I agree with that. So
Yeah.
how do we codify
Well,
that
I
sentiment?
have some language that I think we could put
Okay.
in a resolution that would at least make sure that discussion happens later. We can't guarantee what's going to come out of that, of course.
Well, they listen to all of our conversations, right? So they're going to know what
But-
our sentiments are.
But I think with the imperviousness itself, the council has expressed concerns about imperviousness countywide.
Yeah.
And has tried to work with the applicant to try to, as best as possible, find some common ground. Here, the applicant proffered something that they felt would still allow the project to go forward.
Sure.
So.
Do you want to put, I'm sorry.
So is this so you're still suggesting that we put forward the 42% limit?
Yeah. Can you share with us your recommendation?
Yeah, my suggestion was basically the applicant's alternative, which was presented at the public hearing, which is, marginal reductions. These are not not getting to the executive level of reduction. But the representative characterized it as still allowing the project to move forward. They would be making marginal adjustments to their plan to do that, and they would, by doing that, they'd be securing, not massive reductions in imperviousness, but 5%. That's not bad in the Northwest Branch, going from 47 to 42. And once again, we're not setting a precedent here. We've worked with the applicant on this. We're not saying there must be X amount of imperviousness for every PIF.
To me, that almost makes it a little worse, right? That each project that we get, we're arbitrarily making a decision on impervious levels. And so
Well, every PIF is different, too.
every PIF is different, and I get that, right? I think that one of the things that I'm grappling with is that we take this job very seriously, and I never want to make a decision that I don't have all the information. And I feel like this is a situation where I'm being asked to determine whether 42% impervious surface for a particular project in the Northwest Branch is sufficient, adequate, good, bad, when I don't have any knowledge about this. And typically what we would do in this situation, we would look to the law, or we would look to the guidance, or we'd look to something other than, yeah, that sounds good to me, right? So I feel like I'm at a loss for, because regardless of whether we're trying to make a precedent, so somebody comes in here, you know, a month from now with 42% or 45% or 40%, and we reject that for, you know, that I just, it doesn't seem.
What you can rely on is the analysis and wisdom of the planning board when they go through the preliminary plan approval, which is what you all have recommended, what the board has recommended. They will take into account the stormwater management study that will be done for this site. They will look at the, you know, how this interacts with the neighborhood. This does not require a conditional use approval. So a lot of the very specific details will not be looked at. But the planning board will consider those issues. They will consider the imperviousness issue and whether or not what has been proposed is adequate.
And thank you, and that appreciate that. We very much rely on the expertise of the planning board, and so in this regard, my preference would be for them to tell us what is a good number here.
Yeah, so I am going to repeat a little bit of the conversation then with the planning board, and you are hitting on that point. So again, we staff did not recommend a specific imperviousness limit for this application. In general, stepping aside from this very specific application, we try to limit imperviousness on site through regulatory applications when implementing our various master plans. Even in urban areas, we're trying to make sure that open spaces are functional spaces, that it's not just stormwater management, it's not a leftover space. So we're trying to green up sites as much as we can, both for stormwater and for leisure, recreation, et cetera. We don't say, oh, there's no imperviousness limit, so go ahead and pave your whole project. In a case like this, especially with this conversation going the way it is, we know there are sensitivities historically to that effect, and we would work with the applicant to try to reduce imperviousness as much as possible. But at the same time, we stop short of agreeing to any specific imperviousness limit at this point, and for very similar reasons. So I will also note that there is an SPA on the southern end of the GSSC master plan that you may remember from your time as a co-chair, co-chair of that committee. There isn't a specific imperviousness limit in that SPA that clips that southern portion. But I'm sure you recall the projects that we were bringing forward that did not stop us from having difficult conversations with applicants trying to really reduce the amount of imperviousness and how much parking do you really need and how is that arranged, et cetera. So I'm just, again, thinking of a couple examples on the fly here that directly relate to this conversation.
I appreciate that. So I think that, couldn't the, our recommendation be subject to the approval of the planning board? Or whatever, not the planning board, subject to the approval of the site plan review, whatever it is.
That is typical for a PIF use. Generally, what the council has adopted is that the approval requires approval of the planning board's approval of a preliminary plan that is largely in conformance with the concept plan that's been submitted. Obviously, if they're going to negotiate imperviousness limits, as part of that plan review, that's going to change a little bit. I think what we'll be looking for is that there's not any more imperviousness than is shown in this plan.
Right. So what I'd like to recommend,
Yeah,
and
sure.
I associate myself with everything you just noted, and I'm looking towards the master plan, and I appreciate Mr. Pratt reading the master plan for that area, and so we know what the guidelines are, and I trust the planning board and its staff to look at the site plan, to review it, and to approve something that fits that area, not only from size and scope, but from the environment as well. And so, Mr. Levchenko, can we approve this and without dictating the terms of the planning board? I agree with some compromise and would urge them to find, to reduce the overall imperviousness from what was originally.
Well, I think, based on what you're saying, my phrase here would, the 42% limit would be replaced with basically conforms to or is less than what is in the concept plan
Yeah.
that they presented to us.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the language here we're just taking that 42% and either make that the 47% or some other language to take out the number entirely. But note I think the first part of it you sounded interested in, which was asking them to look at all the best practices they could do on the site, which they're
Absolutely.
going to do anyway. But then also with a goal of reducing imperviousness further, if at all possible.
Yep.
Yeah, I feel like that, then future applicants would know that this 42% isn't just a number, it's related to the concept plan.
Great.
All right, I'll revise that language and, circulate it with the committee.
Great. Thank you.
And thank you all for my education.
All right, we only have 3 more requests, and they are part of a package review. These were the 3 requests I mentioned earlier that had to do with arguing peripheral status being adjacent to the Rockville sewer service envelope. So I think I've got a picture here showing the 3 properties. Trying to remember the road. Trying to remember the name of the road, Alan.
Carriage Court.
Carriage Court. Okay. Yeah. All right. So this is the Watts Branch Stream Valley area. The city of Rockville is right here. This is this area is part of our water and sewer, Potomac subregion planning area. These properties are the ones requesting service, the 1, 2, and 3. They're outside the planned sewer service envelope. You do have service on these properties down here, but for some of the same reasons we talked about before, this property can't be served except by some sort of easement from this property. So it would not qualify under the traditional peripheral sewer policy. But these properties had said that they're peripheral to the Rockville sewer service area. At the time, there's a lot of discussion that from the executive side that was not envisioned as part of the peripheral sewer service policy when the master plan was written in 2002, but that we should go ahead and clarify that in the 2022 plan, which we did. So these requests were deferred pending that, and now they're back for denial. You can see how these properties could be served, and I don't think we would actually ever approve a alignment going directly into the stream valley like this, but they could, from an engineering standpoint, be served this way, or this property could also be served. They could all be served by a extension along the street down here and then into the stream valley area here. But staff's comfortable with affirming the denial that was envisioned a couple of years ago when this language was first discussed, and the planning board and the executive staff and the executive and planning board recommended denial of this as well.
I concur with both recommendations.
All right, so that's it. we will work on some of that language we talked about with some of this and schedule it for council review.
Sure. And then also just want to re-up the conversation or one of the takeaways from somewhere along the line that when we take up the bigger plan next year, we codify that residential, right?
Yes.
And put that in, because I think that will be helpful.
can do that.
As always, fascinating conversation. I'm glad we were able to work through it. It is, I'll use the word, a fun intellectual exercise, right? And appreciate everyone working through all of this. And thank you, Mr. Ovchenko. And with that, we're adjourned.
Thank you.